Welcome back everyone to the Drydock episode 321, part 2 of the Patreon Drydock for this month. So, well, there's not much else to do. Let's just get straight on with the questions. Lou is British for John asks, in the last Patreon Drydock you talked about Japan capturing Hawaii and using it as a jumping off point for invasion to the US mainland, with the conclusion that it's not really practical. But how about Japan capturing Hawaii, Midway and Wake Island purely so that it hinders the US entering the Pacific War? If Japan held these islands, they would have control over most of the Pacific. So how would you advise Admiral King to retake Hawaii and Midway? Well, kind of in reverse order. Midway is the relatively simple of the two in terms of actually retaking it. Now, of course, you will have to fight a fleet battle at some point in retaking one or the other of these, and that's a separate matter. But in terms of actually taking Midway atoll or island, Midway is simultaneously really good and really terrible to defend. It's good to defend in that its surface, if you can call it that, is relatively resistant to shore bombardment. So with a relatively decent set of trenches, unless you get a direct hit, you're probably fairly safe. Conversely, it's flat, has almost zero terrain features, and is relatively small, which means that there's only so much you can fit on the island, and any fortifications that you put up are going to be very obvious and relatively easy to blow away. So for Midway, you just do what the Americans historically did in the Marshall and Gilbert Islands, bombard it for a couple of days, and then land several tens of thousands of troops on it, and advance. It's not necessarily going to be particularly pretty, but one of the advantages of minimal cover on Midway is that if you saturate it with enough explosives, the troops defending it are going to be shell-shocked, if nothing else, as in, not PTSD, but as in literally having their cognitive faculties impaired by the huge amounts of explosions going on around them. And you'll clear it out one way or the other relatively fast. Hawaii is a slightly different matter because, of course, there's multiple islands in the chain. Those islands are considerably larger. They're proper islands, so there's terrain and forests and all this kind of stuff. The main thing with retaking Pearl Harbor and Hawaii as a whole is going to be speed. And, you don't want to rush it, obviously, but you also don't want to leave it too long because Hawaii is at the end of a very, very long logistics chain for the Japanese. So assuming somehow they'd manage to take it, it would require a lot of upkeep, a lot of maintenance, and it would also be quite a bit of a hassle to get a lot of field guns and fortifications transported out either in component form or as whole things. That will obviously change over time. The more stuff that's shipped in, the more fortifications are created, the harder it gets to take. There's also a good chance the Imperial Japanese Navy will base itself there, or at least forward elements of it. So Hawaii is more likely where you're going to be confronted with a fleet battle, and of course it has air bases, so there will be land-based aircraft there as well. Normally, in this kind of situation, my first bit of advice would be to cut off the island using a submarine blockade, which will work especially well against the Japanese. The problem is a vast number of US citizens are trapped on Hawaii, and you can absolutely guarantee that the Japanese will make sure that all the civilians will starve before they go hungry. So long-term blockade and weakening is not really an option. What you can do is try and target incoming supply vessels that you, either through intelligence or through lucky guessing, can assume are carrying field guns and that kind of stuff. So, military transports as opposed to regular transports. Then, well, luckily, the US Navy has practiced attacking Hawaii many, many times in the various fleet problems in the interwar period. So one of the things that is known, let's just, for the sake of simplicity, say we're going after the island that Pearl Harbor is on. The rest of them can be dealt with a bit later on. There's quite a few different places that are good for landing. And this, again, is why speed again, relatively speaking, is of the essence, because as long as the Japanese garrison is relatively small, so you're talking high 4 figures, maybe even low 5 figures if you get really unlucky, they're largely going to be concentrating on defending Pearl Harbor itself and keeping the civilian population in line, which means that they cannot offer extensive defense in depth across the entirety of the island. And that allows you various options. So intensive reconnaissance flights, come up with assault plans for pretty much everywhere that you know can be assaulted, and don't commit yourself to one or the other until the last minute. So lots of seaplane overflights, and then once your carriers are in range, lots of carrier overflights to check out what's going on. Now, obviously, you will have to try and suppress the airfields that are present there, and you may have to fight a fleet battle as well. But once your amphibious forces are on their way, the main point would be to identify which areas that you know are good landing spots have the Japanese not defended or have defended the least. And then I would probably say actually send a decoy force, so empty troop transports for the most part, over to somewhere that's perhaps a little bit more obvious and reasonably well defended, but not massively, and try and force the Japanese to think that's where you're massing your troops or to land, because then obviously they'll go for that, and then hook your actual invasion force out of sight of the Hawaiian Islands themselves, and then approach directly at speed, preferably at night, the area you actually want to land in. So you show up that morning and land as fast as possible, catch them off guard, get as many troops as possible ashore as fast as you can, and then once you've got your beachhead and can expand out, then, well, defending all those other beaches becomes either pointless, so they pull their defenders from there to concentrate on defending Pearl Harbor or trying to contain the beachhead, and if they do, well, then you can land on those other spots in supporting operations, or they keep their defenders on the other beaches in case you try exactly that, at which point you've just locked down a bunch of Japanese troops who now can't do anything to your main advance. And then, ironically enough, given that we're fighting the Japanese, you're essentially doing what the Japanese did to Port Arthur, which is rather than try and sail straight into the mouth of the naval base and take it by storm, you fight your way around it, surround it, and hit it from inland over a sustained period of time, and then perhaps finish off with a final assault. The big question that's going to be hanging over all of this is, where is the Imperial Japanese Navy? Because if they're going to fight to defend the islands, then you need to send your fleet out, i.e. your carriers, etc., to fight the Japanese first, and not have the amphibious ships anywhere near that. Or if you've already beaten them, or the Japanese fleet is falling back to defend somewhere else, and they're just using this as essentially a giant speed bump, then obviously you sail with the amphibious forces ASAP. Camino John asks, here's something a little fun for you. Imagine you're a senior administrative official and a serious naval enthusiast at a maritime facility where a large number of ships are coming and going on a regular basis. This can include docks, moorings, warehouses, victual stores, dry docks, and repair facilities. Your position affords you a lovely home where the top floor contains your bedroom and a private study, plus a lovely connected balcony, etc., etc. Given your position, you'll be able to make informal visits to any ship that piques your interest, and you'll also be able to make sure that all ships are well taken care of, the officers and enlisted needs are met, etc., etc. Now, outside of Europe and the continental United States, which location would you pick in the world to be in this position for the following timeframes, and why? Classic Age of Sail and through to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Well, bearing in mind we're talking about can't do Europe, can't do the continental United States, I would probably pick Bermuda, because that's an incredibly heavily trafficked area throughout that period. The Age of Steam and ironclads, I really would want to be at Malta. Now, Malta is not part of continental Europe. It is an island in the middle of the Mediterranean and is physically closer in some respects to northern Africa. So I'm going to fight my corner and say I'm going to stick with Malta for that particular decision. The pre-Dreadnought age, I'm probably going to have to go with Japan because I've exhausted my Malta option And at that point, pre-Dreadnought wise, if you're not in Europe and you're not in the US, Japan's going to be the next best thing for major pre-Dreadnought construction. World War One, I'm probably going to go back to Bermuda. It would either be Bermuda or Halifax, but there's really not a huge amount happening in any specific port outside of that. I mean, you could go back to one of the Japanese ports, I guess, but there's really not a lot happening in the Pacific naval-wise once von Spee skedaddled, and that's over pretty quickly. The interwar years, again, I'm probably going to remain in the Caribbean, probably the Panama Canal. That will be quite the interesting set of transits during the interwar period. And then World War II, Alexandria. Well, you've got the Mediterranean fleet, you've got Admiral Cunningham, you've got various odd bits and pieces of the French fleet, the Italians show up after a while. It's a very busy and interesting place, and of course it's in Africa, so you can't accuse me of playing silly games like I did with Malta earlier. Mark Griffiths asks, where do you sit on the scale of Ultra solved everything and shortened the war by 3+ years to the impacts of Ultra are given a bit too much weight, and why? I tend towards the idea that Ultra shortened the war by a number of years. I wouldn't necessarily say 3 years, maybe a year to 2. But obviously looking at it purely from a naval perspective, it is difficult to quantify because there is a huge mushroom cloud shaped exclamation point at the end of World War II. So, given that the atom bomb program was not affected by Ultra intel, whether or not it existed doesn't really change whether or not the atomic bomb gets developed. The war was going to end in 1945 one way or another, even if the Allies had barely even gotten out of France, or even, not even gotten out of Normandy. Once Berlin and so forth disappear under atomic fire, the war is ending. So it would perhaps be more correct to say that Ultra ensured that Germany didn't get nuked because it meant that the Allies had enough resources to actually invade Germany, and therefore Germany was out of the war before the atomic bomb was ready. And you can then scale that, how far along from preparing to D-Day to breaking out of Normandy to taking northern France to entering Germany proper would the Allies have been along without Ultra. And I say that mostly because with Ultra decrypts, there were a few German operations that were known about and were either able to be intercepted or mitigated or evaded. And more generally in the U-boat campaign, although they couldn't use Ultra in the way that might seem to be best, I just use it to divert merchant convoys away from known wolf packs, it could be used to give merchant convoys the heads up or very slight course changes that might make a wolf pack attack less effective. And the simple reason for that is, of course, if the convoys developed a seemingly magical ability to dodge every wolf pack the Germans put out there, then, well, the Germans will probably figure out pretty quickly that somebody had worked out how to tell where the wolf packs were, the most obvious one being, oh look, they've broken our codes, which would then mitigate the effectiveness of Ultra entirely. So although they might have to make the difficult decision of allowing a convoy to sail into a wolf pack, they could tell the escorts, hey, look out, you're approaching a wolf pack, it's at roughly this location, so be ready for it. And therefore they could also assign escorts and hunting groups to the specific areas where wolf packs were known to be, and not therefore waste escorts in areas where the wolf packs weren't. And therefore, obviously, this increases the number of merchant ships that make it through to the UK, which means there's more resources available and more ships available, which means the war ends sooner because you're not having to build as many ships and as much replacement equipment, and so on and so forth. But how exactly you quantify that in precise terms is something that people are still debating down to this day. Stafford Magnus asks, why were the funnels on early British cruisers raked back? Was it to give them a distinctive profile to aid in identification at a distance, to decrease wind resistance, or for some other reason? There is a slight margin for wind resistance, because if you optimally shape a funnel, and that does include a degree of raking, you reduce the air resistance slightly, and you tend to see raking, at the time it's very often done, on smaller, faster ships, where of course air resistance will be significantly greater and they tend to have more funnels anyway. But on most of the early British cruisers and some of the interwar ones as well, the main focus seems to be on getting the smoke away from spotting positions, which is somewhat ironic given what the British would do with some of their early Dreadnought battleships, but that's by the by. More broadly speaking, on a cruiser, especially an early cruiser like this one, HMS Arethusa of World War I vintage, you can see that the highest spotting point is on that little mast just above the relatively minimal bridge and superstructure. And if you look at where the funnels are, particularly the forefunnel, if that funnel was vertical, then it would be very easy for smoke and hot air and gases and embers and everything to reach up the mast, and whoever's on it is more than a little bit cooked. Whereas even when you're running at high speed and producing large amounts of smoke, not only obviously if you've got a bit of a slipstream going, but if the funnel is already throwing the stuff backwards, it will tend to stay going backwards to a certain extent and thus preserve the guy on the spotting top. And this, I suspect, is probably the reason, because of course destroyers and the pre-World War I cruisers and so forth are also quite small ships, so the relative distance is between the forefunnel and any spotting areas that you want to keep clear are going to be quite small. On a battleship, the proportional distance might be the same, but the physical distance might be greater, and especially if we're talking about pre-dreadnoughts, just not going as quickly. Therefore, in terms of billowing smoke, you might be okay. And in the interwar cruises, it seems to be a little bit of a back and forth as to whether this is a good idea or not, because of course a raked funnel is a bit more of a complex, heavier, and therefore more time-consuming shape to do, rather than just a vertical funnel. So you do have to bear that in mind as well. Maximus Tillman IV asks, I recently watched your Leyte Gulf interview with the US Navy Institute, and also saw the alternate history of Centreforce confronting the standards of the 7th Fleet, which led me to ask the following. Japan sent almost the entirety of their surface fleet into one battle, which was obviously of smaller numbers and with less effective anti-aircraft guns than the forces available to the US. If this manoeuvre was replicated using US Navy surface forces, i.e. the 10 standards are sent in as instead of Southern Force, and the 10 US fast battleships are sent in instead of Centreforce, would the surface fleets be able to punch through the carrier forces? I think, broadly speaking, yes. The Southern Force would be the more dicey-interesting one, because on the one hand, assuming we're sending in the 10 US standard battleships, apart from 7th Fleet getting very confused when their doppelgangers come after them, the new Southern Force has the majority. It has a significant numerical advantage. The flip side, of course, is that they're surrounded by PT boats, destroyers, and cruisers as well in the night. Now, of course, they can return a considerably more effective counterfire, but ultimately it is a fairly narrow approach, and so you're sort of feeding themselves somewhat linearly into 7th Fleet would be an interesting set of circumstances, because it could go either way. You could have one ship after another chewed up and spat out by 3 or 4 battleships concentrating on it, or if it takes a little bit too long to chew up and spit out the first one and the other battleships pile up, then preponderance of fire will probably eventually break through 7th Fleet, but obviously depending on how many torpedoes and other hits are coming in from the lighter forces as well. Now, so that could go either way. Obviously, if it does go the way of Southern Force, they've got a fairly short journey to go and attack the landings. But the Center Force, if you've got the 10 US fast battleships, that is pretty much game over, because the Iowas are considerably faster than Yamato, etc. So they can relatively easily charge down Taffy 3 and deal with it. And of course, Johnston's tactic of hiding in rain schools isn't going to work against US radar-directed fire control systems. And once you've blown through Taffy 3, Taffy 1 and 2, with the best will in the world, probably are going to suffer quite significantly if they try the kind of ad hoc air attacks that historically Taffys 1, 2, and 3 did try in the face of, late war US Navy massed battleship anti-aircraft fire. and then they can proceed at speed either with the Iowas running ahead or with everybody running at 27, 28 knots. And, well, I don't need to really go into too much detail about what 10 fast battleships showing up off the landing stages is going to do, or whether or not 10 fast battleships can deal with whatever's left of 7th Fleet, assuming they somehow manage to see off the 10 standards coming through Surigao Strait. Now, if whatever combination of battleships make it through to the landing zone manage to survive Halsey coming back, that's another matter, because of course you've also got Admiral Lee and most of the doppelgangers of the US fast battleships there, but in these switch circumstances, the US ships would definitely reach the landings. Grummancat asks, with all the commotion going on over the Spanish galleon San Jose and the salivating salvos waiting to move in, has any appreciable archaeology been done on what the ship looked like, what equipment she had, and anything of historical value, and where can we find more information? I think a fair bit of work has actually been done on recording the ship, certainly from an external view, and therefore what she might have looked like relative to what she looked like when she originally sank. Unfortunately, getting hold of anything other than a few press release photos is going to be pretty difficult, if not impossible, because if the original searchers and salvors have any significant amount of information, they're not going to be releasing it anytime soon, either because they're being proprietary or because otherwise they might get in trouble compared to what they said they'd done to find the ship. And the Colombian government seems to be treating the whole thing with a huge amount of secrecy, which is understandable because, outside of very carefully curated press photos, anything else that might give away its location, because apparently it's actually in a different location from where when the original discoverers actually said it was, that could cause unauthorized salvage to occur, shall we put it that way. And I think, therefore, that if there is more out there to be seen from various expeditions, particularly that the Colombian Navy has done, it's probably either difficult to access, you'd have to go and ask them directly, or potentially they may just be sitting on it and up and until their salvage efforts are complete, and then they'll release it all at once, again mostly for secrecy reasons. Jonathan Smith asks, can you tell us a bit more about the World War I high-speed lighters used by the Harwich force, such as H3, which was involved in the shoot-down of Zeppelin L-53? So these came about from a relatively interesting idea. The problem that the British were facing in the First World War was that they had a bunch of seaplanes and flying boats and so forth, but their range was still limited because we're still talking a very early era of aviation. And so if they wanted to conduct patrols and reconnaissance in the deep North Sea or even go after the German coastline, well, that wasn't going to happen unless there was some way of getting said aircraft to the area so they could take off and use their fuel there. The problem was, well, aircraft carriers were also in their infancy, and seaplanes and float planes tended to be a bit big anyway, and if you towed them around, they tended to break up in the waves. Because, well, they're still aircraft, they're fairly lightly built. So all of this is somewhat difficult. And then someone had this idea, well, why don't we build what's essentially a barge, but a shaped barge? So the interior is scalloped to accommodate the hull of our seaplane or flying boat. And instead of being slow like a barge, we're going to give it a more ship-like bow, and it's going to be a semi-planing vessel because it's basically lightweight but can be towed at high speed by small cruisers and destroyers. You then put the plane on this hull, which gets then towed around at the high 20s or low 30s of knots, thus transits out to the area you want to start your patrol in. You slow down and flood some ballast tanks, thus releasing the plane, which can take off, do its thing, come back, and then once you've maneuvered the plane onto the lighter, which is weighted so that it's sort of aft heavy anyway to allow easier access, then you use compressed air tanks to push the water out of the ballast tanks, almost said inflate the ballast tanks, and then up it comes and off you go. So all good. This worked out reasonably well for a while until somebody thought, well, now we've actually got some fairly decent single-engine fighters. What about trying to do that? Because World War One era fighters could take off with a headwind of about 25 to 30 knots, and this was the kind of speed that could be generated, as you can kind of see here. So everyone thought, yeah, well, that's a good idea. That's a way of getting, the Harwich force and other light forces to bring their own fighter cover with them, potentially go hunting Zeppelins, as would eventually happen. And the first experiments were a wonderful combination of ingenuity and missing the blindingly obvious. So, yes, traveling at 30 knots, that would be enough airspeed to get the aircraft to essentially just take off pretty much vertically. But they forgot that the lighters, as we said, had been designed to be aft heavy to allow the recovery of the seaplanes and to, more easily become a semi-planing hull, which meant that instead of taking off 30 knots on the flat, the aircraft were trying to take off 30 knots uphill, which meant they actually lost airspeed and promptly crashed. So then you get this rather bizarre reworking of them where you have a small flight deck that's literally just, about 60 foot long, because the lighter is about 58 foot long, built on top of it. But when the lighter is proceeding at speed, so it's aft down and bow up, the flight deck needs to be level, which means that when the thing is stationary, it looks like the flight deck is actually more like a ski slope heading down. But the net effect is that when you're running at 30 knots, now the fighter is at a level and can move forward at 30 knots and however much speed it's getting from its engine and take off. And as you can see in this picture, that worked out quite well. It turned out the aircraft needed like 5 to 10 feet to take off when the ship towing it was moving at speed. And that's how poor old L-53 got shot down, because they saw a bunch of British light craft towing potentially or being followed by some kind of small craft, not really much of a bother. So they flew around going, yeah, well, that's interesting, but we're off doing other things. And unknown to the Zeppelin, the Leyte had actually launched a fighter, which very slowly made its way up to altitude and shot down the Zeppelin. But post-war, they all went away pretty quickly, partly because the first true aircraft carriers were in the middle of development, which obviously allowed you to carry a lot more aircraft like fighters in various configurations. And for smaller ships, well, cruisers were now getting big enough to launch and recover their own aircraft, and destroyers should therefore be with something that could provide air cover without needing to tow one of these. And in case you're wondering what happens if you launch an aircraft off of one of these things, there is a little small fold-away crane, so although the aircraft can't land on it, it could crash nearby, pilot could be recovered, and then the crane could be used to bring the slightly damp aircraft aboard for repair and reconditioning. John McCarthy asks, even before World War I, the Kaiser wanted to build a fast battleship which combined the armour and armament of a battleship with the speed of a battle cruiser, or cruiser. There must have been significant technical and financial hurdles to realising his ambition. What do you think were the most serious obstacles, and which ones would you rate as the most difficult to overcome? There were two major obstacles to being able to create a fast battleship pretty much at any point prior to about the very late 1910s, early 1920s at best. One of which is financial. It was always possible to create a fast battleship, at least relative to the current speed of battleships, if you were prepared to build something that was big enough, because the square cube law is, in this case, your friend. The only problem, of course, being persuading anybody to part with the truly astronomical amounts of money that would be needed to build a ship large enough to carry lots of armour, lots of guns, and the insane amount of engines that you'd need to move at, well, let's say in the pre-Dreadnought era, 22, 23 knots, considering that most battleships moved at 16 to 18 knots and cruisers were 22 to 23 knots if they were good. And then in the early Dreadnought era, you'd be, well, we saw what battlecruiser speeds were early on, 25 to 27 knots, and then going up from there. But cost is one thing. So yeah, you could in theory do it with a stupidly large ship. But if you wanted to be more practical, the single biggest problem was machinery. Because quite simply put, the energy density of the machinery, i.e. how much horsepower you're getting per ton of machinery, just wasn't there early on, which is why you'd need a massive ship where obviously volume growing at factor of 8 compared to area growing at factor of 4 and linear growing at a factor of 2, would work, because in theory you would eventually be able to pack enough engines into something to make it go really, really fast. But on a practical level, the power generation just wasn't there. Firstly, you'd need to switch to oil, which has, you know, a higher calorific value and is easier to pump, especially at high speeds. And then the machinery itself has to get more efficient. So I've put together this little table which shows you how much horsepower you're getting per ton of machinery, in this case in a number of British ships, because I'm just using a single reference source, so you know what counts as a weight of machinery is going to be consistent. So you can see I've selected a few different ships. You've got the last 2 British pre-dreadnoughts, King Edward VII and Lord Nelson, pre-dreadnought classes that is. Then you've got Dreadnought and Hercules, so either end of the 12-inch spectrum, Orion and Iron Duke, either end of the 13.5-inch spectrum, and these are of course all coal-powered, and also you have coal with a little bit of oil, and you can see that you're getting around 10 to 11 horsepower per ton of machinery. Then Queen Elizabeth comes in, and switching to oil almost immediately jumps to around 18-19 horsepower per ton of machinery. Then you have Hood, the introduction of small tube boilers compared to Queen Elizabeth, and now Hood is getting 26-27 horsepower per ton of machinery. So even just by switching to oil, you're almost doubling, probably more like 2/3, 3/4, increasing your horsepower per ton. With Hood's boilers, you're more than doubling it compared to coal-fired, or primarily coal-fired in Iron Duke. And then at the end there, you've got the King George V class of the 1930s, showing just how much advancement had been made in boiler design in between Hood and King George V, because all of a sudden you're now pushing 40 horsepower per ton of machinery. This graph is what makes the fast battleship possible, because, for example, if you tried to build a coal-fired fast battleship circa, let's say, 1912, in the period of the Iron Dukes, you can see that compared to Hood, which is arguably a fast battleship, although there's a lot of argument to be had there, you're going to need about 2.5 to 2.75 times as much machinery to get the same power output. Now imagine trying to fit all of that. I mean, you're talking about, you know, thousands, or probably actually tens of thousands of tons more machinery. And then by the time of the King George V, the efficiency horsepower per ton is, compared to a Queen Elizabeth class with its original machinery refits, more than doubled, which is why you're able to get slightly more power out of significantly less tonnage and space in the Queen Elizabeth class refits, which is why they keep or even improve their in-service speeds whilst adding a bunch of extra armour and weaponry. So assuming you don't want to build something that is absolutely truly gargantuan, pretty much the first time a real fast battleship of a size that's going to approximate roughly something sane by the standards of the time is possible, you pretty much need oil-fired small tube boilers to even have a shout at it. Sage of Irrelevance asks, several sci-fi properties feature space navies that have procedures by which said navies are directed to bombard a planet until its surface is completely destroyed. Exterminatus in Warhammer 40k, Base Delta Zero in Star Wars, etc., etc. The One Piece series features something similar on a smaller scale when the world government directs its navy to raze an entire island to the ground, a buster call. Did any real-world navy ever have an analogous procedure or the capacity to actually perform it? For the sake of simplicity, assume the island they're trying to destroy is similar in size to the Channel Islands. Unfortunately, unless you have an extremely large fleet and a very, very small island, no, it's not really possible. Because, well, this is the very small island of Heligoland, and that, ladies and gentlemen, is what 7,400 tons of surplus ammunition looks like when you detonate it all at once. The idea, in theory, was to remove the fortifications the Germans had put on Heligoland, but there was a non-zero expectation that they might actually obliterate the entire island. However, fortunately for those on Heligoland, and unfortunately for those of us who want to erase large portions of the Earth's surface from living memory, This explosion, which of course using munitions meant it was about half that in terms of kilotons of TNT equivalent, because there was a whole load of metal involved as well. So you're talking about just over 3 kilotons. It put a big dent in Heligoland, to be fair, but the island's still there. You can visit it at some point if you want. So, given that almost 7,500 tons of munitions didn't manage it, and as we've mentioned in the previous Drydock, even high capacity or high explosive ammunition doesn't tend to be 50-50 by weight, the sum total ammunition capacity of a battleship isn't going to be anywhere near that. So even if we go with a really big boy like the 18.1-inch guns on the Yamato, so each of those shells carries, if you're using the high explosive variant, just over 60 kilos or just under 140 pounds of explosive, which means that if a Yamato class was carrying purely high explosive rounds, so 100 rounds per gun, 900 rounds total, you're talking a total explosive yield of about 55 tons. Not kilotons, just tons. Which means that to even reach a kiloton, let alone about 3, you'd need just over 18 Yamatos. Now, to be fair, something like, say, the US entire battleship fleet, so all the surviving standards and all the fast battleships put together, given that some of them are carrying 12 guns, admittedly they're all carrying smaller ones, but if all of them were loaded out purely with high explosive, and you factored in the high explosive impacts of the secondary batteries and so forth, you might be approaching something like throwing 2 to 3, maybe even 4 kilotons of explosive at a problem. But, as we've just established, even putting that amount of explosive all in one go on a very, very small island isn't going to completely destroy it, or indeed even erase everything from its surface. At which point, destroying entire islands or their surfaces of any appreciable size is basically a non-starter. Now, in theory, you could try perhaps with, something like the Grand Fleet circa 1918, or, as we said, the combined US battleship force at the end of World War II. You could try something like a creeping barrage over an island and hope you don't run out of ammunition before you reach the other end of the island, which might have rather deleterious effects on pretty much everything that's sticking up out of the surface that's not particularly strong. So, houses, trees, small landscape features, and so on and so forth. But even then, you'd be looking at being able to, technically speaking, not obliterate, but at least heavily damage almost anything above ground level on a small island. Once you get to something like Guernsey or Jersey, yeah, you could do a lot of damage to the place, but area and randomness rules against you. So if, for example, you were going to go after the 120 square kilometres of the Channel Island of Jersey, if you take into account that it's commonly stated a high-capacity shell from, let's say, an Iowa-class battleship is about 50 foot across. So if you were to mathematically place shells in such a way that each crater has a lip touching, so you're arranging them kind of like the 4 on a dice, then in order to do that, you would need approximately 48,000 shells, which means you'd need about 41 Iowa-class battleships entirely loaded with high-capacity rounds, landing their shells with absolute precision, one next to the other in grids, in order to cover the island of Jersey with craters. And even then, obviously, there'd be little diamond-shaped areas that weren't craters, because circles touching each other in nice grid patterns will leave those diamond shapes. Now, that pretty much would obliterate everything on the island of Jersey, but the US never had 41 Iowas or an equivalent amount of firepower and battleships concentrated in any one place at any one time. And, of course, that is ensuring perfect mathematical layout of the shells. In reality, the shells are going to go a little bit all over the place. Some are going to go they're pretty much not going to go exactly where you want them to go, which means you're going to have overlapping craters and hits in the same places and other areas that are missed, which then obviously changes how many shells you'd actually have to fire, and therefore how many battleships you'd actually need in one single long bombardment. to a point that you have to, combine the fleets of probably every single dreadnought ever built, and then maybe through random happenstance you'd be able to physically destroy the upper surface of an island the size of Jersey. HMAS Albatross asks, in a dry dock a while back, you mentioned that a transom stern is more efficient, but only above a certain speed, which is one of the reasons why it only really begins to appear in 20th century warships near the end of the time period the channel covers. Did ships in the Age of Sail have full transom sterns? And if they did, were they only capable of speeds well below this threshold, meaning that the stern actually then acted to slow them down? Not quite. So Age of Sail ships are not a case of as above, so below. Although they do have very bluff bows and sterns for the most part, certainly compared to what we might normally think of, as you can hopefully see from some of these layouts, the actual underwater portion of the ship's stern is actually somewhat hydrodynamically shaped, and there's a few good reasons for this. Partly the drag effect of a full transom stern, but also if you have a transom stern and you're moving very slowly, it can be very difficult to get meaningful water movement, and certainly coherent water movement, over the rudder. And since, as with most Age of Sail vessels, certainly warships, the rudder is mounted in line with the hull, not stuck underneath the hull like you might find on some modern ships, it really, really needs something in the hull lining to actually direct the water to it. And that's particularly if you look in this set of diagrams at the lower one, you can see the general lines of the hull in comparison to the hull immediately above it, and you can see that actually the underwater portion of the hull does taper quite significantly towards the stern, but it's not helped by the fact that above water the stern is pretty flat with the galleries and everything, so that can give the impression of a transom stern, but hydrodynamically it isn't. In fact, one of the worst offenders for this is Vasa, because Vasa sits very, very high, or sat very, very high in the water, and had a very, very flat stern. And it's only if you get right down onto the absolute lowest level that you realise that, the little underwater bit of her stern is actually still shaped rather than flat. And obviously it's the underwater part that counts. Now, of course, that does mean that when a ship was pitching and down by the stern, and if the bow is pitching up, then you would get temporary transom stern effects, which would not help in keeping the ship going forward. But then it also depends on how far above the waterline does this flat portion of the stern start. On some ships, it starts almost immediately, and in others, for Age of Sail warships, there is actually quite a clear amount of space above the waterline where the hull is still somewhat shaped. Lord Druken asks, during World War II, we had classes of battleships that featured gun turrets with 4 gun barrels in at least one turret, particularly the French Dunkirk and Richelieu classes and the British King George V class. Did any other nation that built battleships use, or consider using, 4-barreled gun turrets in their designs? And for those that didn't consider this, why not? Quad, quintuple, or even sextuple turrets were all considered by various navies at various times. In fact, pretty much every major navy at least looked at the quads. As for why they didn't adopt them, particularly in the case of the Second World War, the Russians looked into it, but as we know, they never completed a battleship after the Ganget, so, well, whether or not they would have actually built anything with a quad turret is up in the air because they never tried. But then you've got the Germans, and as we said before, well, for German capital ships, getting a triple turret at a serious caliber was going to be a bit of an ask, considering Krupp's obsession with sliding breech blocks and brass cartridges. So asking them to do a quad turret in a major caliber, well, yeah, you're going to have to build some absolutely ridiculously monstrous ship unless somebody can beat a clue into the Krupp managers and get them to adopt a interrupted screw breech block. The Italians looked at it briefly and decided, they preferred the triple turret because that fitted with the displacement of ships they were building. The Americans did look into quad turrets quite seriously, and in fact had the London Naval Treaty 2 actually stuck, or at least appeared to look like it was going to stick for maybe a year or so, the North Carolinas would have been built with quadruple 14-inch turrets, because that is what they were approved to be built with in their final design, before everybody realised actually, this London Naval Treaty system has completely broken down, and they were redesigned to carry triple 16s. So, of all the non-British and non-French major navies, the Americans are actually the ones that came closest to it, because it was only the collapse of the treaty system that meant they didn't do it. The Japanese very briefly considered the idea, but considering that they generally wanted the biggest guns they could get on whatever ship they were using, that meant twins and triples were pretty much the order of the day, because having a quadruple turret implied that you weren't putting a twin or triple that was of a bigger caliber on the given hull. And in Japan, that would be, why are you not doing that, followed by beating with a stick. Sapper Ninja asks, if you could make one of the following Final Countdown style ship swaps for one battle only that the earlier ship took part in, which ship and battle would you choose to make the greatest historical impact, assuming that the ships are fully combat capable? Either swapping in USS Enterprise CVN-65 for CV-6 at one of her battles, HMS Queen Elizabeth R08, that's the modern carrier for the 1913 Queen Elizabeth, the 2005 Andrea Doria for the 1913 version, the 2015 Karga for the 1928 version, the 2019 Bretagne for the 1912 version, or the 1977 Kirov for the 1938 version. So for greatest historical impact, I'm going to rule out Kirov, because although a Kirov-class battlecruiser showing up in the Baltic in World War II would be highly amusing, the Soviet Kirov-class cruiser never really got into any particularly major naval engagements, and we're talking about swapping the future ship in for one specific battle. So, outside of something really, really rules-lawyery, like, Kirov appears and randomly launches nuclear-tipped cruise missiles in a completely different direction at, I don't know, the Eastern Front or something, which, okay, yeah, that would be a fairly big historical impact. If we're looking at the actual engagement it's fighting, it's not going to make a huge difference. And even if it does use nuclear weapons, ultimately what happens in the Baltic between the Soviets and the Germans, especially over just for one battle, even if there's utter destruction on one side or the other, doesn't really affect history as such. It's not going to change the tide of a campaign or something like that. Similarly, with Bretagne, the only thing that the modern frigate would be subbing in for would be Britannia's small part in Mers el-Kebir, and assuming we're subbing like for like, so she's basically powered down and not prepared, with the best will in the world, the modern Britannia is not going to stand up any better to 15-inch gunfire than the old one did, and in fact probably worse. And even if she magically was able to get some of her weapon systems online in time, from inside Mers el-Kebir, the chances of targeting anything outside with a handful of exocets are pretty slim, and, well, exocets versus heavily armoured capital ships is probably not going to end very well. I mean, you could potentially argue that if she's magically able to poof all her weapons into fully operational condition, unlike Britannia, which wasn't ready, and volleys a bunch of exocets, presumably guided by a helicopter, to something like Ark Royal, that could have a big historical impact, but I think it's stretching things a bit. The current Karga, F-35s are nice, but as far as I'm aware, she hasn't actually operationally deployed with them yet. So for a single battle, something with a few helicopters isn't going to make a huge difference. The current Andrea Doria is a frigate, and that means essentially, if we're going by a single battle, that means putting her in first Surte. Now, she'd probably cause more damage to the Royal Navy than her historical counterpart did, but for one battle only, given that she's an anti-aircraft warfare frigate, she really doesn't have all that much capable of doing massive historically changing damage to, the British fleet at first Surte, which leaves us with our two big carriers, Enterprise and Queen Elizabeth. Now, This one took me a while because both ships were historical ones, CV6 and the Bat Queen Elizabeth class battleship, were present for a lot of battles. And therefore, you've got a wide choice of what you can sub them in for, and potentially some fairly interesting effects. But overall, I think just about I've gone with Queen Elizabeth, because ultimately CVN 65 just makes the US Navy win harder in various battles that she takes part in. But ultimately, that, does that actually change the course of the Pacific War all that much? Not really. The closest one I could come to would, in terms of historicity, would either be literally Final Countdown style CVN 65 taking the place of CV6 in the run-up to Pearl Harbor. CVN 65 then could, in theory, just send a massive wave of Super Hornets to sink the Kido Butai as they're launching the attack on Pearl Harbor or just before, which obviously that would have a fairly major historical impact. But I think that's stretching battle the ship took part in. But you could potentially also argue that maybe when Enterprise escorted Hornet, that was not necessarily a battle, but it certainly was an operation more so than Enterprise vaguely sailing in the direction of Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941. That could have some fairly major historical implications because, of course, at that point, the ship would be within range of mainland Japan, and, well, if CVN 65 happened to be carrying a bunch of nuclear freefall bombs, you could get the instant sunshine in a can a few years early, and, well, the war's over almost before it starts. That would have a fairly major historical impact, but that's more of a land bombing thing than a sea battle. So and this is why, if I'm going to be, I think, more towards the spirit of the question, for a sea battle in particular, I'd go with Queen Elizabeth, because stick every F-35B that UK currently has on her, put her back to a battle HMS Queen Elizabeth historically took part in. Oh, the Battle of Jutland. Yeah, a bunch of radar-guided F-35Bs loaded with various interesting smart bombs make very short work of a good chunk of the High Seas Fleet. And if the entire High Seas Fleet is destroyed in 1916, that's going to have some fairly major impacts on the outcome of World War I, which then will have knock-on impacts on whether or not World War II occurs at all, and if it does, when, where, again, and against who. So that, I think, would be my biggest historical impact, because essentially you're changing the outcomes of potentially 2 world wars instead of just 1. Coneled asks, firstly, clarification on previous question from last month. I meant, was there an incident where an Allied soldier or commander was eventually tried and convicted for a war crime in the First or Second World War, as I'm not aware of any situation where that happened. Even in the Laconia incident, like you mentioned, no one was legally held accountable in the end. And as for this month, you've often mentioned that you need at least a 4-gun salvo for good data points. Could you go through a sample calculation for adjusting naval gunfire and show why you'd need that 4th data point so much compared to, say, a 3-shot salvo? What's the practical mathematical reason why the 4th shot matters so much? And what kind of statistical impact does it have? So with regards to the war crimes question, for naval stuff, I'm not aware of anyone being tried and convicted from the First or Second World War specifically for war crimes. There are a few officers who were court-martialed and dismissed from service for conduct that it was thought was beyond the pale, but those were very rare and handled through the regular military courts and chain of command rather than a separate war crimes trial, which, to a certain extent, the Nuremberg trials were kind of the start of a brand new trend. There had been vaguely similar things in the past, but Nuremberg was pretty new in terms of holding the enemy to account for something. Now, as for the 4-shot system for salvos for range finding, there's a lot of different factors, a lot of probability and statistics. I'll try and cover some of it. So, for one thing, let's look at probability of failure. Now, I'm going to use somewhat arbitrary numbers because, of course, numbers will vary on a gun-by-gun and fire control system-by-fire control system basis and things like the weather, so there's no one fixed value. But let's say, for sake of argument, that if you fire a given gun from your ship, let's say you have a 1/3 chance of that shell going completely off the reservation. Not by a huge amount, but let's say at the expected range, your circular area of probability is 300 to 350 yards. And ideally, most of your shells should land in the inner half of that, so 150, 175 yards. But let's say the odds of a shell landing at the edge of that or a little bit beyond it are 1/3. So 2/3 of the shots you fire with this gun will land within a couple of hundred yards of each other, let's say, and 1/3 of them will land outside of that, whether it's on the edge of your CEP or completely beyond it. So you fire one gun for ranging. So there's a 1/3 chance the shot you're observing is completely off. So that's not great. So instead you fire 2 guns. Well, the good news is the chances of both of those shots being off is now a little bit below 11%. But, well, that's still really an unacceptably high number when you're trying to estimate the range to a target in the middle of a battle. And 2, if one shell has gone off target, so there's still a 1/3 chance that one shell's gone off target and an 11% chance that both of them have. Well, if one shell has landed vaguely on target, you don't know which one that is, because you're looking at 2 shells have landed in 2 separate locations. We'll take a wild guess. Now, if you fire 3 shells, you'll be glad to know that the chance of all 3 going completely away from where you're aiming is now down to about 3.6%. So now you're getting into the realms of where it's, relatively unlikely that's going to happen. But obviously there's still a single individual 1/3 chance that something's gone off course. So if something has gone off course, and bearing in mind that statistics work the other way, if you've got a 66% chance of each shell actually being on target, once you have 3 guns firing, you actually only have, roughly speaking, just under a 29% chance that every single one of those shells is on target, again assuming there's a 1/3 chance of a miss. So yeah, there's a very, very low chance that all 3 are off target, but actually it's more likely than not that one of them is. Now you know that one of these is off target. Which one? If you've got, say, for bearing, it's fairly obvious whether the shells have landed too far forward or too far after the ship. But particularly for ranging, if you've got a splash over and 2 splashes under, for example, now figure out which one is wrong, because it could be that one of the splashes that are short is wrong, and you've actually got a straddle with the other 2, so you're actually on target. Or it could be that the 2 splashes nearer you are correct and the one that went over is wrong, in which case you're short. So now you have a 50-50 decision. Which is which? You don't know. Unless, of course, the one shell has gone wildly, wildly off course. But most of the time we'll just be talking about unhelpfully off course. But if you go up to a 4-gun salvo, well, now the good news is the odds of every single one of your shells going skew-whiff are approximately 1%, just a little bit over 1%, but this is well within acceptable margins, and of course we're talking about a fairly unnaturally high 1/3 chance of the shells going off course anyways, just to make the point. Now, flipping that around with your 2/3 chance of success, there is only about a 19% chance that all of your shells are on target, so you're going to think, okay, well, at least one of them is off target, again assuming these arbitrary figures. But it's now much easier to work out, because if you have, let's say, 2 shells over and 2 shells short, and one of them has potentially gone off course a little bit, well, that's still a straddle, because at least one of your good shells is over and 2 are short. Now, working out exactly which one that is a little bit difficult, because you might be just a fraction short or just a fraction over, but you're broadly on target, so this is good. If you have 3 shells short and 1 over, it's very, very, very likely that those 3 shells that are short are the accurate ones and the one that's over is the dodgy one, so you need to increase range. And flip side is, if 3 shells are over and 1 is short, then you need to decrease the range, because it's extremely unlikely that your 3 grouped over include a dodgy one and 2 others, and then somehow this other one that's very short is on target, is the one that's off target. And now, of course, you could in theory have 2 or 3 shells that have gone wildly off course, but the odds of that are, as we said, very, very much lower than just one going off course. And, well, if everyone is grouped short or everyone is grouped long, then you're way off target, so you need to adjust anyway. But essentially, having that additional shell in the 4-gun salvo gives you a lot of certainty when you get what might appear to be a partial straddle, as to whether you actually have a partial straddle or whether you are a little bit over or a little bit short, which allows you to dial things in much, much faster. Now, of course, realistically, the odds of a gun going wildly off course are considerably lower than 1/3, but it's an arbitrary figure, as I said, used just to illustrate the point, to give you an idea of how rapidly figures change. Peter Caboon asks, in your video about Queen Elizabeth class developments, you mentioned a proposal for a 5-turret design. If this design was chosen and it was also decided to use small tube boilers, would this design be able to achieve similar speeds to the historical Queen Elizabeths, i.e. a little bit less power but better length to beam ratio? Following this, what would a 1930s refit of this class look like? Perhaps similar to the Italian refits and able to get past 25 knots? So a lot of this would depend on exactly how much weight and space was devoted to machinery, so exactly how much longer the hull is allowed to be. If you have something that looks vaguely like this being constructed, if you use the power to weight ratio of machinery to horsepower that you get from the small tube boilers in Hood, for example, then that would suggest that to produce 75,000 shaft horsepower, which is what you would need to get this design up to, well, assuming that roughly speaking displacement etc is the same, it's not going to be, it's going to be a bit more because you've got more guns on it. But you know, with, as you said, with a slightly better length to beam ratio, it might balance out. This is very rough and ready, bear in mind, but it would suggest that to get 75,000 shaft horsepower, you want about 2,700 to 2,750 tons of machinery. If you went with 2,500, 2,600, you'd still get maybe 23.5, 24 knots, but you're not going to hit 25. If you want to hit 25, you need 2,700 to maybe even 2,800 tons of machinery, which is a lot less than you'd have on a historical Queen Elizabeth, because you're using small tube boilers with roughly Hood levels of energy density. So it could, in theory, be done. It would be a somewhat large vessel. Certainly not exactly the 10-gun design that they were thinking of going at 21 knots, because you would need a bit more engine space, but it's entirely plausible. Following on from that, what would the 1930s refits of the class look like? Now, that is a very interesting proposition, because on the one hand, having 10, 15-inch guns is a huge attraction. I mean, it's 20% more firepower, well, 25% more firepower if you're starting from an 8-gun perspective, or 20% more firepower if you're looking at it from a 10-gun perspective. But with that said, with the way the Italians went with their ships perhaps being something of an example, I think it might be very tempting for the Royal Navy to go down the route of potentially putting in for an Italian-style refit. Exactly how they do it would be an interesting factor, but with the amount of space and weight that you've got available, it would in theory be possible to push these things up to fast battleship territory if you spared the weight and increased the space by taking out one of the aft turrets. And, well, a 25 knot 10 gun ship with 15-inch guns is one thing, it's somewhat useful. But a 27 or 28 knot ship with 8 15-inch guns, bearing in mind Richelieu and Bismarck have 8 15-inch guns, albeit newer ones, and able to therefore keep up with your King George V class, that's hugely tempting. I think they might go for it. I mean, you eliminate Q turret, That also gives you space to potentially put in aircraft installations, which would be a very big thing in the 1930s. And then you've also got a lot of amidship space for putting in your twin 4.5s. So at that point, you might end up with something that looks like a slightly longer than historical Queen Elizabeth, with 8 guns, significant flight facilities, which of course might later end up being sacrificed, and a lot of anti-aircraft firepower, able to move at 27, 28 knots, and therefore keep up with King George V, which would be a very interesting proposition going forward. Greg M. asks, in World War II, most, if not all, American Navy pilots were officers. In the Japanese Navy, many pilots were enlisted men. What was the difference in philosophy between the two navies that caused this, and did this difference have any practical impact in naval air operations during the war? Now, unfortunately, this does lie a little bit outside of my expertise, because although it is naval related, it is very much getting into the weeds of essentially Air Force doctrine around flight officers versus pilots that are enlisted and so on and so forth. And I really don't know enough about that to give you a full and comprehensive answer. My best guess in terms of practical impact would be probably that it didn't make a huge amount of difference, because a pilot is a pilot. You're still talking about skilled aircrew. You do not want to lose them. And while it might be tempting to say, oh yes, but if some of the Japanese pilots are enlisted, then maybe the Japanese saw them as more disposable than officers. Well, that might be the case if it was Britain or America or Italy or Germany that was doing extensive kamikaze programs with partial enlisted personnel available to choose from. But in Japan, everybody was expected to die for the emperor, or whether you were officer, enlisted, sailor, ensign, midshipman, admiral, whatever. If you sailed in the Imperial Japanese Navy, then dying gloriously for the emperor was possibly going to be the epitome of your career. And so, trying to work out, did the Japanese send more of their enlisted pilots in as kamikazes compared to their officer pilots? I unfortunately don't know. I think this might be a question perhaps for someone like Chris from Military Aviation History, or Rex from Rex's Hangar. I'm really sorry I can't give you a better answer than that, but I genuinely don't know. But I would be very interested to find out if either they or someone who's done more reading into the intricacies of pilot hierarchy wants to chime in. Peter Dasso asks, after World War II, the Republic of China-Taiwanese Navy took possession of 2 Japanese destroyers, Yukikaze and Yoizuki, as well as various other small craft. What level of technical assistance did they receive from Japan in operating these ships, or were they expected to just figure out everything on their own? And how long into the 50s or 60s would these ships have remained viable if they'd been able to get supplies of Japanese ammunition and torpedoes? Being very much a post-war environment, I'm not entirely sure. However, given that the initial armaments that they were fitted with were basically just taking stuff that had been taken either off of them or other destroyers and putting it back on, there would have had to have been a certain degree of Japanese assistance, and notionally, by that point, they were on roughly the same side anyway. So, while I defer to people who have studied the Cold War and therefore have more experiences, particularly with this particular theatre of operations, I would estimate that there would have been a certain amount of knowledge transfer from the Japanese Navy to get the ships up and operational again, because obviously initially they are given to Taiwan as individual ships disarmed, and then they are rearmed once they're actually in Taiwanese service. They are, of course, then refitted with 5-inch guns and 3-inch guns, etc., basically American guns. As far as I can tell, that's less due to any issues with getting a hold of Japanese ammunition and torpedoes, and just more to do with the fact that by that point they are either receiving or about to receive a whole bunch of surplus US Navy destroyers, which will end up replacing them, and therefore it's just better to have a coherent armament across your fleet, especially something as small as the 1950s and 1960s Taiwanese fleet. There's no point in having 2 separate supply lines for 2 separate sets of weapons from 2 separate countries, especially since one of them, that being the Japanese forces, is going to have an ever-diminishing stock of those weapons and ammunition and supplies and so forth. it just makes sense to consolidate around a single lot, considering that Yukikaze survived in some form of service until the late 1960s, albeit Yoizuki went out a little bit earlier. Yeah, I think they pretty much remained viable for as long as they were likely to. I mean, they saw out if you take out the bit periods they were somewhat inactive, you're talking about pushing 2 decades of service for Yoizuki, pushing 3 decades for Yukikaze. That's about as long as you can realistically expect a ship like that to last without a very significant and major overhaul. Primark 359 asks, following up on my question regarding the definition of a torpedo bomber in which you establish the B-2 is not a torpedo bomber, at least not at the moment, is Ikara a torpedo bomber? Does a torpedo bomber need a human pilot, or does it just need to have wings and drop a torpedo? And does Ikara and systems like it have roots in the time period that the channel covers? Definitely does seem to fit in the mould of British ideas cooked up in a shed. Well, before they tunnel through the centre of the Earth and murder me in my sleep, I must point out Ikara was an Australian-developed weapon, and it was very definitely of the Cold War era, so I don't think it really has its roots in the time period the channel covers, other than the idea of fly thing, drop torpedo on target. But yes, the idea is a pretty good one. I rather like the Ikara system. Now, as for whether or not it's a torpedo bomber, see, my initial instinct would be no, because it is simply a delivery system that goes off and crashes nearby once it's dropped the torpedo. Whereas, to my mind at least, a bomber is a reusable vehicle that carries ordnance to a target, rather than a one-way delivery system. That's more just, a missile with a payload, much in the same way as Project Pluto is not a bomber, even though it could deploy bombs. It is a missile that happens to be equipped with bombs, and various other systems are like that as well. So Ikara in its original format, I would say, is not a torpedo bomber. You have the British variant, which can be fitted with all sorts of weird and wonderful things, including such things as free-fall nuclear bombs, which theoretically make it capable of taking on surface targets as well, which is perhaps verging towards the idea of a bomber, because it now has interchangeable payloads, but it's still not coming back. So although I would say of various modern things, Ikara is the closest to a torpedo bomber that's not in the traditional vein, because it is winged, powered, and deploys a torpedo separate to itself. Because it is a one-shot device, I would hesitate to say it is in and of itself a torpedo bomber. Perhaps a Ikara 2 that might be developed in the 21st century, that's some form of drone equipped with a torpedo that comes back, would be the first unmanned torpedo bomber. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, how was the Naval Airborne Lifeboat Mark 1 RN1 to be employed? By specialist flights, general issue to Barracuda torpedo bomber squadrons, and did any other navies make similar attempts to employ airborne lifeboats from carrier aircraft? The whole topic of airborne lifeboats in World War II is a rather fascinating one, and maybe something I might do a Friday video about in the future. But they were also very, very specialist and somewhat difficult to set up units, because you had to make them fairly light for two reasons. Firstly, obviously, they had to be carried by aircraft, which obviously had load limits. And secondly, they had to survive being dropped at relatively high speed, which meant you really didn't want to have a particularly heavy lifeboat, simply because a heavier lifeboat would hit the water with more energy and therefore potentially be considerably more subject to damage or destruction. Now, both the British and later US air forces in World War II developed airborne lifeboats, but these were mostly for use on twin-engine, or in the American case, four-engine bombers. So they were considerably larger. And bearing in mind, it's not just the weight of the lifeboat. There's an engine, there's sails, there's supplies, food, water, radio, etc., all on board as well. But the Royal Navy looked at this situation and said, yeah, this is a good idea generally, because obviously there are going to be situations where you can find pilots who have been shot down, but you can't necessarily do all that much to rescue them immediately, either because they're dozens or hundreds of miles away from a ship, so the ship might go out to get them, but it might be several hours, possibly even a couple of days before they get there, during which time the pilot's in the water. There might also be other considerations, like whether or not the raft, if they had a raft in their aircraft, was able to be deployed, and how much supplies they have then. The sea might be too rough if there's a flying boat, so in the Royal Navy's case, perhaps a walrus or something like a seaplane could come and get them, but if the sea's too rough, that can't happen, or that kind of aircraft might not be available, and so on and so forth. And so the Royal Navy decided, well, this idea of essentially bombing people to health with lifeboats was a good thing, but when you look at just how much work had gone into making the ones that could be carried by multi-engine bombers light enough, the challenge of, okay, well, now we need to make one that's even smaller and even lighter to go on a carrier-based aircraft was another step up. So they got the guy who designed the one for the twin-engine bombers for the RAF, and he designed this one. So you can see here is a Barracuda actually flying with the RN-1 Naval Airborne Lifeboat. Unfortunately, as far as we can tell, Fairy really only did testing. A few dozen of them were produced before the war's end, and if there was any operational use, I haven't been able to find any evidence of it. So it seems to be a product in testing by the time the war ended, which makes sense considering that the first iteration of an airborne lifeboat on the Allied side, which was the RAF version, only really came into use in 1944. And thus, at least for the time period that the channel covers, it seems that the Royal Navy was the only one to think of this idea. As far as deployment, as from what I've been able to find, and also from putting that together with the way the Royal Navy operated various kinds of specialist flight in the war, I don't think it would have been a dedicated, well, here's a Barracuda with a lifeboat attached to it. The whole point of the airborne lifeboats in general, and particularly the RN-1, was to be able to mount onto pre-existing mountings, in this case obviously for torpedoes. So my suspicion is that rather than issuing them to Barracuda bomber squadrons, there probably would have been a certain amount allocated to each aircraft carrier that happened to carry Barracudas, and for the ashore stations they might have a few assigned to them as well. And then if a pilot went down, then a Barracuda could very quickly be loaded with one and sent off to try and find the person and then throw a lifeboat at them. The advantage, of course, with the Royal Navy specifications was that, generally speaking, Royal Navy aircraft would have a maximum crew of 3, so the lifeboat only had to support 3, ideally. Maybe have a little bit of space for more if there were more than one aircraft gone down in the same place. But the RAF and later USAAF versions obviously had to support more because you might be talking about a bomber crew. It would also depend, I think, on operational circumstances. So in the late war, if they had been used practically against Japan, well, at that point you're in a situation where the Japanese war machine really has by 45 been beaten into submission. So I suspect they could afford to have maybe 2 or 3 Barracudas set up, preloaded with these things, and just kept on the deck. And then off goes the flights. If anyone gets shot down, they're hot and ready to go. Whereas in a more intense conflict, so let's say this thing had been developed 2 or 3 years earlier, and you're talking about the Mediterranean theatre, then at that point it probably would have been a case of, okay, who has arrived back and has an intact aircraft, we're sticking one on you. Essentially, are you facing a peer opponent, or can you take the luxury of keeping a few aircraft back purely for rescue purposes? Vintage Car History asks, all humility aside, what are the top 5 things you've accomplished or been lauded for as a result of establishing your channel? In no particular order, I would say being recognised as a historian by other historians. That's always great. Meeting a bunch of the authors of the books that I've read, and being able to increase my collection of books so that there are even more authors for me to meet, which is all good. I think does that count as 1 or 2? being able to visit far more museum ships than I ever thought I would be able to do in my life, because obviously, when you've got a day job, you have a limited amount of annual leave, and therefore you have to plan your holidays accordingly. And of course, any museum ships that I did go and visit would be entirely on my own expense. Of course, things are still entirely on my own expense. The difference is now, because I'm doing it for work purposes, they are a tax-deductible business expense rather than just pure money coming out of my account, which is all to the good. And I suppose connected with that is not only being able to visit the ships, but also see parts of the ship that, as a regular visitor, I wouldn't be able to, which, is obviously a huge honour. Which leaves us with, I guess, if you're connecting, those last couple of things in pairs, then that leaves us with two other things. Again, I was saying in no particular order, being able to meet and in many cases become friends with the curators of various ships, which, in and of itself is great, because honestly, to become the curator of a museum ship, you have to be fairly enthusiastic about ships. And of course, meeting a whole ton of you guys. I think last time I kept track, I've met something like over 1,500 different subscribers over the course of various trips, probably more than that. And that's really cool as well, because hey, it's a bunch of other people who are interested in naval history and are willing to take time out of their day to come and see the ships, and, well, me as well, I guess. And we all have a nice chat about it. And the other useful thing, of course, is that, as I've said before, 99.9% of all museum ship staff and subscribers I've met have all been really nice people, happy to chat and share their knowledge, and even if they disagree on something I've said, it's always been done nice and politely, which does give a huge amount of hope for the fact that, yes, polite discord still exists in the world, and, the random people who just rant off on places like Reddit or occasionally Twitter or X or whatever the heck it's called this week are very much in the minority and, shockingly enough, aren't actually prepared to put their money where their mouth is in the real world. Reaver's Rambling Recess asks, that the first Dreadnought missed out on the greatest battle of Dreadnoughts strikes me as a terrible shame. Could HMS Dreadnought have been built in such a way, with the constraints of the time, to still be relevant in the line of battle and thus have her day in the sun at Jutland? And assuming what is needed could be done, what might the knock-on effects of Dreadnought's revised specifications have meant for the ships that followed, since she was, after all, a ship that demanded response by her very existence? I think the change would be pretty minor, all things considered, because when Jutland occurred, Dreadnought was in the middle of a refit, and then subsequently she became head of a unit of pre-Dreadnoughts who were based further south to stop German bombardment efforts and so forth. And she was allocated to that because essentially she was the oldest Dreadnought in the fleet, and it gave a little bit of additional firepower and speed to the pre-Dreadnought units, and also tells you something about what the Royal Navy considered to be necessary to drive off German battle cruisers, given that, obviously, as I said, Dreadnought was the oldest Dreadnought-type battleship in the fleet. But in terms of if you want her to be at Jutland, well, two things would need to change. Firstly, you just need to change the date of that refit, because, regardless of where she's destined afterwards, if she's in a refit, she's not available, much the same as, 2 or 3 other battleships and battle cruisers in the Grand Fleet. So, assuming that's relocated slightly, you're then left with, well, why was Dreadnought moved away? Well, she wasn't moved away permanently. She would rejoin the Grand Fleet later on in the war. So, it's not that she's been demoted out of the Grand Fleet just because she's the oldest vessel, and it's not because of her armament either, because remember, the Bellerophon and St. Vincent classes are, main armament-wise, near enough identical copies. The Bellerophon's pretty much spot on, and the St. Vincent's pretty much the same, just with the 50 caliber guns. Obviously, there's a few minor layout changes and so forth, but broadly speaking, the layout and type of Dreadnought's guns do not obsolete her from the battle line. I think if there was any decision making particularly going on other than, well, she's down there for refit, so she might as well stay down there as head of this unit, the only other real consideration as to why you'd put Dreadnought down there instead of one of the Bellerophons would be because Dreadnought was designed with the 12-pounder secondary battery, whereas the subsequent near copies of her had a 4-inch secondary battery, at which point, for unified command and unified response to torpedo boats, that may be why they sent her instead of one of the Bellerophons. So, yeah, my change would be just to give her a 4-inch secondary battery, which would make her almost identical to a Bellerophon, which then means if the refit is hand-waved either to take place a little bit earlier or perhaps scheduled for a little bit later, but either way means she's technically available to fight, then at that point, there's no real reason why you wouldn't send one of the Bellerophons instead of Dreadnought, which then gives her only a 1 in 4 chance of being the one that is picked to go and head this unit of pre-Dreadnoughts. So that relatively minor change would give her a decent chance of hanging around, and doesn't really affect any response ships because, well, every ship that was built thereafter had a heavier secondary battery anyway, and I think after reflection they probably would have preferred Dreadnought to have one as well. Robert Olweiler asks, there's a marked difference between the hull forms of American cruisers and battleships compared to British cruisers and battleships, say Town and Cleveland or South Dakota and King George V. And I was wondering why this was, and which could have been said to be more advanced. Was there research done on one side of the Atlantic that didn't make it across the pond, or is it a result of diverging design priorities related to their intended missions and envisioned areas of operations? A lot of what you see, especially with the cruiser design, is not so much because one design is more advanced than the other, although there are a few cases where that might be the case, but a lot of it is just to do with, well, there are a number of choices that you can make when you're designing a cruiser in the late 1930s, or in the Town Glass case, perhaps the early 30s. And which elements do you prioritize more than others influence what your selection choice for those elements is. And obviously that's influenced by things like operating environment. So if you take, for example, the Clevelands and Towns, like you mentioned, some of the more distinctive features that you'll see is up front, you can see that kind of line running about a third of the way from the upper deck of the British ship's bow. That's a knuckle. That was something that the British kind of stumbled upon to a certain degree back in the First World War. And the idea of that is that by having a relatively flared lower portion of the bow, and then having essentially this knuckle, so it's a very sharp change in profile, you're just now building up height rather than flaring, you get pretty much 99% of the benefits of a continuously flaring bow, but without the additional weight penalty of constantly having to make your bow wider and wider and therefore heavier and heavier. And it works because you get increased freeboard without so much increased weight, and that was pretty much British standard design practice going forward. Now you might say, well, why didn't the Americans do this? Well, there's another element to this. As you can see with the Clevelands, they've gone with a flush deck approach, so the upper deck is one continuous deck, whereas the British have gone for a higher forecastle with a quarter-deck break, which you can see just aft of the first funnel on the British cruiser at the bottom. And this too has its advantages and disadvantages. So a quarter-deck break induces a stress point on the ship, which obviously if it's acted upon by significant force might be an area where breakage in the hull might occur or propagate, whereas on a flush deck hull there's not really that weak point. Conversely, the flush deck hull means more weight above the waterline because everything has to be almost on a level, and because of that you can't build the bow up quite as high as you might necessarily want for seakeeping, so you have to have this upwards curved bow. And as you can see with the Cleveland class, that means a fairly steep bow if you're on the deck with a continuous flare, which is going to impose something of a weight penalty as compared to the British approach, where you can see, although there is a little bit of an upward sweep at the end, it's nowhere near as severe thanks to the build-up of freeboard allowed both by having a higher foredeck compensated for by a lower quarterdeck and that knuckle setup. So essentially, in this case, in very crude terms, what you're trading off is a degree of seakeeping, the British bow being somewhat better at that, in exchange for somewhat increased overall hull strength. And part of these design choices are also motivated by things like where are you putting the aircraft. So on a Cleveland class, the aircraft are mounted aft. You can see the big aircraft crane on the stern there. Whereas on the British ship, there's a full hangar setup mounted right behind the bridge superstructure. So on the British ship, there's a much more massive forward superstructure, but a considerably smaller aft superstructure compared to the American ship. And the need to launch aircraft means there's a space, quite significant space on the British ship between funnels, whereas on the American ship, the funnels are much closer together. Now, of course, this means something of a weight penalty for the British ship, but it does make the aircraft more survivable and makes their launching easier, if not necessarily the recovery. The jury's a bit out on that. Whereas on the American ship, they're saving weight and removing potentially volatile substances like aviation fuel from amidships at the expense of, well, the aircraft is going to be far, far less durable and launching it might be a bit more of a problem. Now, that's the cruisers. I think the battleships probably merit their own video at some point, because whereas with the cruisers, it's a lot of, well, we want this thing prioritized, therefore we sacrifice this other thing, or we make this different design decision. With the American ships, the fast battleships in particular, there are some very, very heavy constraints on their design when it comes to things like the Panama Canal or compactness but a need for speed and so on, which are actually far more heavily weighing on American battleship design decisions as compared to American cruiser design decisions. And, you know, with the British, there are other considerations which obviously dictate why the King George V look like they do, and particularly notable, obviously, the requirement for dead ahead 0 degree elevation fire, for example, which pretty much everybody acknowledged was a mistake. But because of the far more complex external influencing factors rather than design preferences in the case of the cruisers, as I said, I think I have to take that one offline for some other time. Elliot W. James asks, Brassey's Naval Annual 1905 has a chapter analysing the Dogger Bank incident. The author, Admiral Sir Cyprian Bridge, takes a very balanced approach to the affair and points out that in naval manoeuvres of British and foreign navies going all the way back to 1887, as reported in Brassey's, there were frequent failures to identify ships at night, especially torpedo boats. Errors resulted in failure to engage an enemy or in blue-on-blue fire. The Admiral considered that problems of identifying ships at night would continue in warfare after 1904. Could you comment on how far Admiral Bridge was correct? I would say broadly, yes, Admiral Bridge was correct. There are significant issues identifying enemy ships at night, even in World War II, and there would be continuous incidents of either ships getting far too close for comfort or being missed, or alternatively ships either actually having friendly fire incidents or thinking they had friendly fire incidents when in fact the enemy was hostile, as enemies tend to be. Whether or not that excuses the Russian 2nd Pacific Squadron at Dogger Bank, I don't think it does necessarily, because there are these things called searchlights, and if you are uncertain of the idea of something and you think it's pretty close and therefore dangerous, so you should shoot at it, well, apart from anything, highlighting the things with searchlights makes it easier to lock on and fire on them. And while there are, if you like, forgivable instances of misidentification between different classes of warship, or indeed between different sides of warship, warships still look like warships to a certain degree. They have guns and funnels and tend to be fairly sleek. Whereas if you look at a circa 1905 era torpedo boat, long, sleek, low in the water, minimal superstructure, etc. And then you look at a circa 1905 fishing trawler, short, dumpy, big superstructure cabin, lots of cranes and nets, etc. Yeah, if they'd taken more than 5 seconds to switch a searchlight on and go, hey, look at this thing, it would have been very obvious that that is not a torpedo boat. But problems in identification would continue, mostly based on assumption, because unfortunately, to a certain degree, until you switch on a searchlight and have a very detailed look at something, an awful lot of what you do in a night action is based purely on assumption. So even with radar in World War II, radar back then, and even to a certain degree now, doesn't give you a profile of the enemy ship. At best, it might tell you, well, this contact is bigger than that contact, but you don't know, what is that contact. You have to make an informed guess. So if, for example, you're sailing in Guadalcanal in Iron Bottom Sound at night, and you know that, well, I'm the lead ship of the only friendly formation that's supposed to be here, and there's a bunch of other vessels moving at speed to my north, let's say if you're the US, then, well, logically, they are not going to be my ships, because I know where my ships are, they're behind me. Therefore, given the speed they're moving at, they must be enemy ships, therefore we must engage them. Now, strictly speaking, you haven't actually confirmed whether they're enemy destroyers, enemy cruisers, or if they're enemy at all. There's a very, very small outside chance they could be a completely unrecognized friendly formation that's got horribly lost, but you have made a reasonable assumption based on the available facts. And, of course, in that case, the one we outlined, you would have gotten it right, but, of course, in a slightly more confused situation, you might make the wrong call, and that might end up with you either firing on a friendly or not firing on a hostile until it's very much the last minute, or they open fire on you. Or you can get really weird situations where circumstances lead you to a very logical conclusion based on what you've observed, but ends up being the wrong one. So, for example, at the Battle of Cape Matapan, at one point HMAS Stuart finds herself sailing between two of the Italian Zara-class cruisers, Zara and Fiume, and they realise they've been spotted, and of course the Italian cruisers have spotted them, and they're sitting there going, we are very, very, very dead because we're at point-blank range to a pair of heavy cruisers. There is no way we survive this. So they decide to open fire with absolutely everything they have, which happens to include a pair of Breda machine guns, so Italian machine guns that they've salvaged from an Italian ship on a previous mission, and they've used to supplement their own anti-aircraft firepower, but, waste not, want not. Except, as it turns out, the Italians, having already thought about the possibility of a night action in which, friendly fire might occur, have equipped all of their automatic weapons with tracer shells that are green, white, and red, the colours of the Italian flag, in, I think it was that order. And the idea, of course, then is, well, if everyone opens up at night, we can see what the tracers are. Okay, therefore, that's a friendly ship. And, of course, Stuart opens up. Green, white, and red tracers go flying out left, right, and centre. And suddenly the Italian heavy cruiser is like, well, clearly this is one of our escorting destroyers, has gotten slightly confused. And just as well we didn't blow it out of the water, we can take a few machine gun hits. Please stop firing, but off you go. And off goes HMS Stuart, obviously understandably hightailing it, wondering, in a slightly confused pattern, why the Italians didn't shoot them up, but happy and that they survived and not really going to question it. So that's a slightly esoteric example of confusion of identification at night. Greg Germain asks, in your video, A Drydocked Battleship, What's Below the Waterline, at the 5-minute 20-second mark roughly, I see the stern of New Jersey. I noticed what seems to be the case for all the Iowas, and perhaps various other ships as well, bent and deformed hull plating at the stern, most noticeably at the grey sections, but also on the black boot top. Why does this occur? What is the metal thickness at those locations? Is that not a weakness of the hull at a point where critical steering gear is located? Well, here's some of that plating in question. Now, the hull plating thickness along the hull of an Iowa-class battleship varies quite considerably depending on where you are. So if you're amidships, it's going to be considerably thicker than what you'll get at the bow and stern. That's partly just for weight-saving purposes, because, of course, if you've got an inch-thick plate or a half-inch thick plate, or even a quarter-inch thick plate, which do exist in some of the extremities, well, the quarter-inch thick plate is going to weigh 1/4 that of what a 1-inch plate does, and therefore you can cover 4 times the area for the same weight, and saving weight is especially important at those extremities. And also, to be perfectly honest, the steering gear is in its own little armoured box, so the presence or not of quarter-inch, half-inch, or 1-inch thick STS plating doesn't make all that much difference if there's a significant projectile coming your way. And so as a result, in this case, I suspect what you're probably looking at is 1/4-inch thick plating. Ryan would be the best place to advise on exactly how thick each plate is, but I know that some of the plating around here is 1/4-inch, and so is some of the stuff right up at the bow. It could be 1/2 inch, but either way, the reason why it's dished in is simply, well, you can actually see the framework that's been highlighted by the dishing in, and because it is essentially a big sheet of relatively thin metal, it's going to have quite a bit of force acting on it externally, whether that be the pressure of wind and waves battering it, or as you can see above there would have been stuff hanging down, which might have bashed into it as well. You can also see there's a little mark there on the right from one of the tugs and so forth. And without any significant constant force acting on it from the inside, because obviously people aren't going to be wandering around there smacking into it with, 1/2-ton tables or something, over time the metal is just going to deform and be beaten in, and that's what you see here. In theory, if the ships were still in service, if it got bad enough, then they might cut those bits of hull plating out and replace them. But the thing is, these days, the dishing is pretty stable because, well, all of the Iowas are anchored in relatively calm locations, Wisconsin especially, and so it's not going to be a problem that's going to be getting any worse. And, well, they're still fairly big panels, so unless you know someone with a serious panel beating hammer and a lot of time on their hands, it's not really a high priority to really change anything about it because it's not a threat to the ship. Eugene Thatcher asks, I guess this might be a weird one, but frogmen were used in most theatres of World War II. What is the history of said swimming naval troops? Additionally, American Seabees were instrumental in the rapid advancement across the Pacific, so could you explore them in greater detail? Well, looking at the use of swimmers and divers in a naval context, or looking at the history of the Seabees, both of which would be sort of fairly extensive Wednesday videos in and of themselves. And, I did a video on the 10th Flotilla, the Italian Decima Mas, and that only touched the surface of what they did, and yet that was a video all to itself. So, I'll hopefully get around to those at some point. But very briefly, swimming naval troops and diving naval troops actually have a very long history in terms of both reconnaissance and sabotage of the enemy. All the way back to ancient times, there are stories of divers or swimmers being sent out to either check on what the enemy was doing, or to drill holes in their ships, or to set fire to them, or something like that. The slightly odd thing is that there's actually a dip in the overall use of these troops as time goes on. Now, to be fair, it's never a really common thing, but it occurs, I would say, semi-regularly, even in the classic Age of Sail, because spotting is still done by the human eye, especially when you're talking about things happening at night. The ability to spot somebody swimming in a harbour in 1810 really hasn't changed all that much from spotting someone swimming in a harbour in 810 or someone swimming in a harbour in 10 or in 810 BC. It's, some form of flame-based lighting, and that's about it. Now, granted, okay, by 1810 you have firearms and such to try and deal with them, but whether or not firearms at the range you're likely to actually spot the person is going to be any more effective than a bow and arrow or something is open to debate. But then once you get to the latter part of the 19th century, in the era of electric lighting, that obviously makes spotting people a lot easier. Firearms have got considerably longer range and more accurate, and ships are now either ironclad or iron-hulled and armoured, and that means simple things like setting them on fire or drilling into them to make them sink is not really much of an option anymore. I mean, even towards the end of the Age of Sail, it was getting to be less and less of an option because of the sheer thickness of ships' hulls and so forth. And then, of course, you enter the realm of diving, but diving equipment in, the 17th, 18th, 19th centuries is very heavy, relies on external air supplies and so forth, and therefore is not really going to be something you can undertake in the face of a hostile environment because, well, for one thing, where are you going to get your air from? If you're getting your air from a small boat that's managed to sneak in, well, congratulations, you've managed to sneak a small boat in there. You may as well just take some satchel charges, effectively limpet mines, and stick them on without the faff of sending a diver overboard and so forth. And then it's only once you get into to a certain degree World War I and then definitely World War II as you start to see more portable and self-contained diving apparatus that the idea of underwater troops really starts to come back again. Because yes, now you have, as we said, electric lighting, potentially radar, etc., which can look out for people on the surface. But between being able to move around under the surface in something that doesn't look like a massive sack of canvas with a massive bronze or copper helmet stuck on your head, and the ability to use things like self-propelled underwater craft to get you there, like as you can see here with the Italian frogmen on their Maiale, then it now becomes a very much viable. The Italians, of course, are pioneers in this field, but the British also take up the idea with quite a lot of acumen as the war goes on. Explicitly Implicit asks, would nitrous oxide be a good oxidizer for torpedoes in World War II in terms of performance, safety, and ease of use or price? Given the issues that were experienced with using nitrous oxide to a limited degree in World War II, mostly in aircraft, I suspect that actually using nitrous oxide in a World War II context will probably not be all that brilliant for torpedoes, because a torpedo is very weight and space sensitive, as you can see from this diagram of an early torpedo. Although you would obviously get a bit more power by introducing nitrous oxide to the system, which would either give you more speed or more range, it would involve adding an additional fuel canister for the nitrous oxide and all the systems to keep it in that state. Plus you'd have to get an injection system to work with the engine. Plus, of course, if you wanted higher speed, you have to get a heftier and stronger engine because, well, one of the main problems with nitrous oxide in World War II was how much additional power it actually produced. You could end up breaking the engine. And so all these stresses and the extra weight and volume taken up by all these additional systems, I suspect would probably push the cost and weight of the torpedo up to the point that whatever additional power you might get out of it, reasonably speaking, is probably going to be wasted just pushing a heavier torpedo around. And as I said, you've got more complexity, which means more things that could go wrong. If slightly too much is injected, it'll kill the engine rather violently, which at that point you've got a dud torpedo. So yeah, I suspect it's probably a little bit too much complexity for the results that you would otherwise get, unless you set out to do the whole thing deliberately from scratch at the beginning, which might mitigate some of those issues. But then if you were going to do that, then, well, you might as well go down the Japanese route of just using pure oxygen, because that'll give you even more performance. Salamin Shakia 93 asks, what was the performance of the Vickers twin 6-inch turrets used on the Monmouth class armoured cruisers and Humber class monitors? What were their shortcomings or what needed fixing to be considered at least a reliable twin mount design? And were there any twin mounts with 6-inch or other secondary gun calibers ever considered in a Royal Navy and cruiser or capital ship design before the prototype that was mounted on HMS Enterprise? Well, there were two primary issues with the turret itself. There were a couple of issues with its mounting point and so forth, but with the turret itself, the largest issue, as you can probably tell from this picture of Monmouth, was that the guns were too close together, and because the guns were too close together and therefore occupied a relatively small footprint, it encouraged people to make the overall turret relatively small as well. That in turn meant that the turret was cramped, and it was actually rather difficult to work reliably because people kept getting in each other's way. So If you wanted to fix it to make it a more reliable design, then what you probably want to do is just space the guns out a little bit more, which hopefully therefore would force the turret designer to also make the turret itself a little bit larger. That would allow you to maintain a much higher rate of fire, even if you might have to trim down some of the protection a little bit, because weight was an issue for some of ships that it was mounted on. The other issue was that it was one of several examples of the Royal Navy trying to get into either electrically powered or partially electrically powered turrets in the late 1890s and early 1900s, most of which ended rather interestingly, and usually badly. But essentially, the shorthand version is, for whatever reason, the Royal Navy wasn't really able to get electrically operated turrets at that time. Electric lighting and so forth was fine, but if you were going to try electrically powered training and elevation of the guns, etc., better to leave that to the French, who had worked out how to do it properly. The Royal Navy had a very good line in hydraulic power for its turrets, and I think they probably should have stuck with that, and indeed they pretty much did when they realised these problems had arisen. So if they'd gone with a rather more regular, for the Royal Navy, turret drive mechanism plus somewhat better spaced guns, then I think the turret would have been considerably more effective. As far as twin mounts in secondary gun calibers considered for Royal Navy cruisers, capital ships, etc., before HMS Enterprise, they do pop up now and again. I mean, you've got things like Dante Alighieri on the Italian side, which has fairly heavy British involvement in its design, which have some twin-mounted turreted secondaries all the way back when she's being built. The main problems are that, as far as cruisers go, Monmouth is supposed to be an armoured cruiser. By the time you're getting into the 1900s and you're looking at scout cruisers and light armoured cruisers, aka the World War I Town class and then the Sea class, it's a bit of a struggle just to get single sixes on them. So getting twin sixes on something that size is essentially just ruled out of the question immediately. Occasionally, the idea on the scout cruisers of a twin 4-inch was considered, but not really all that actively. And similarly, when it came to the capital ships, every now and then someone would suggest either a twin 4 or a twin 6, or later on maybe a twin 5.5 in the 1910s period. But the additional weight, complexity, and stability implications usually meant the idea was fairly swiftly discarded in favour of either more casement or superstructure mounted singles. BFW asks, how did the horsepower per tonne of ship power plants in the Dreadnought era up to 1950 develop? Was it linear or did it have spikes of rapid growth? And where is the best resource for such engine statistics and how much displacement a given ship's power plant was? Well, this is very similar to a question we've already answered in this two-part Drydock, but I did another graph just for this question. So this one is reflecting US battleships and actually shows a few interesting minor changes, because you can see from USS Texas, the first American battleship, through Connecticut and South Carolina, the horsepower per ton level is pretty much similar, just over 10 horsepower per ton. And then you have the mixed oil and coal era, and then moving on into oil. So that's kind of the Arkansas, Pennsylvania, heading into New Mexico territory. And then you can see as newer, more efficient boilers and so forth are used, the anticipated horsepower per ton for the South Dakota class battleships of the 1920s is higher still. And then you have the North Carolina and Iowa classes of the 1930s and 40s going really high up off the scale at the end. And if you want to do these kinds of comparison graphs, I mean, obviously I've taken a few edited highlights here rather than do every single ship class in either the Royal or US Navies. Your best bet for a single resource is probably Norman Friedman's books if you want British or American battleships or cruisers, because, or even destroyers actually for that matter, because at the back of those big books will be a series of tables, sometimes slightly bizarrely formatted, but nonetheless, which break down the ships by obviously their planned power output as well as their trial power output, plus things like the weight of the machinery, the weight of the armament, the weight of armor, etc. And so not only do you actually have access to that information, but of course, because it's all been done by the same person, the way it's been calculated should be consistent across the board rather than patchworking it together from all sorts of different sources. If you wanted to do that for other navies, then you'd have to start looking at other books, because something like John Jordan's French battleships series, so there's French battleships of World War One and French battleships of 1922 to 56. So, for example, for Japanese battleships, I'm not sure of any single book that probably has that full breakdown. Perhaps Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy, but I don't know if it offhand if it goes into that level of detail, machinery weight breakdowns and so forth. F19A Ghost Rider asks, I've recently started reading Theodore Roosevelt's Naval War of 1812, and I was wondering what your opinion of this account of the war from a naval historiography perspective was. Do you think it still holds up today as compared to how well received it was in its time? It's definitely a valuable and quite useful resource, so I would definitely give it a read if you want to know about the War of 1812. I mean, it was one of the sources that I used throughout my War of 1812 frigate duel series, for example. However, it has to be acknowledged it is a source of its period, and it therefore does have some limitations. So, for example, well, unsurprisingly, it tells a primarily American view of things. Now, to be fair, Roosevelt is probably one of the fairest American authors who's written about the War of 1812, but there are a few things that do slip in here and there. So, for example, when you get the more controversial occurrences in some of the various frigate duels or the war in general, with things like, what exactly happened to Captain Broke aboard the Chesapeake, or what exactly was the state of USS President before she fought Endymion, and so on and so forth. Sometimes he's got access to, obviously, what the US Navy's official line was at the time, or at least what the reports of the US Navy officers were at the time, and kind of takes them as canon without too much reference to either conflicting versions or occasionally even potentially applying a common sense filter to one or two of them. And some of the broader kind of justifications, analysis, etc., i.e. the stuff that's not reporting strictly on the facts of what happened, that can get rather patriotic at times, perhaps to the disservice of objective accuracy. So essentially, I would say, if you're reading it and you start to hear the Star Spangled Banner playing in the back of your head, you've probably got to a bit where you need to take it with a pinch of salt. But, with that said, I mean, he references a couple of British publications that have talked about the War of 1812 that were available to him at the time, and they're equally as guilty going in the other direction, which is why when it comes to something that still excites controversy or feeling, like the War of 1812, you need to be able to read both sides. Hence why there's a list of multiple different sources in the War of 1812 series. So, as long as you're going in with that appreciation, of course, Teddy Roosevelt being a huge American patriot, he's obviously going to be a little bit biased towards the American side of things. As long as you keep that in mind and take the more factual sections more seriously and the sort of more polemic sections a little bit less seriously, then it still remains an exceptionally valuable resource, especially, as I say, when read in comparison with some similar period British authored accounts on the subject, because you get a very, very good idea of what has actually happened and what may or may not have happened, because there'll be an awful lot of agreement in some areas, and then when you find things wildly diverging, then it's up to you to work out, well, is this because they're looking at it from two different nationalistic lenses, or is this because perhaps they have access to two completely different sets of sources about what's happened, or they're interpreting the same facts in a slightly different way? Andrew Waite asks, was HMS Renown still the world's fastest capital ship in 1945? Sadly not. Renown had obviously lost that title to Hood only a few years after she had entered service, but then of course Hood was destroyed, and the Bismarcks and Littorios were not quite as fast as Renown, nor indeed were the Congos. But by 1945 there was a ship class in service that was faster than Renown, and that of course was the Iowa class. And then of course then you get into the weeds of, like, do you count an aircraft carrier as a capital ship? Because obviously a lot of aircraft carriers were faster than Renown by 1945. But if you want to stick strictly to battleships and battle cruisers, then only the Iowas were faster than Renown by 1945, because everything else that could have been faster than her was at that point either decommissioned or sunk. Torino asks, in the Age of Sail, did any non-Western nations build, or have plans to build, ships of the line? I know the Ottomans built a three-decker, but it seems that the Asian nations like Japan started out with small steam frigates before skipping straight to ironclads. Well, it depends on what you classify as a Western nation, but broadly speaking, for the Age of Sail, outside of, as you mentioned, the Ottomans, full ships of the line tended to be the providence of European nations, because of course Russia had a bunch of them, and is technically a European nation, although whether or not you classify it as a Western nation is another matter entirely. And then of course the United States once it got its independence. And that's largely for some fairly easily understandable reasons. Japan only really took building a deep water navy seriously in the latter half of the 19th century, by which point the ship of the line in the classic multi-deck wooden hull construction vein was no longer really a thing. As I mentioned, in the rise of the Imperial Japanese Navy, they did way back build a kind of galleon, which you might kind of call maybe a ship of the line, although the term didn't actually exist at that point. Of course, you have the Americans outside of Europe, but other than that, everyone else is either a relatively small power like the Barbary pirates and therefore doesn't need a ship of the line because it's just a big obvious target for people who want to come after them, or they're still, like Japan was for most of the Age of Sail, in a very isolationist phase and don't see the need for them, so China would fall into that category as well. Or they are in the process of, or have been, taken over and being run by the European powers who do have ships of the line. So, South America, various bits of Africa, India, most of Southeast Asia, can't really build their own ships of the line if somebody else's flag is flying over them. Now, some ships of the line, for example, were built in India, but under the auspices of the British Empire, so therefore they are British, not Indian. And a little while back, there was a little bit of, I wouldn't necessarily say controversy, but some assertions made that some of the pre-Imperial Raj Indian states maybe built their own cannon-equipped warships, which were being described as first rates and third rates and ships of the line and such. I had a bit of a look into it, and while yes, some of the Indian princely states and kingdoms did build their own cannon-armed warships, they were never large enough and heavily armed enough to really qualify as first, second, or third rate ships of the line. At most, they might rate heavy frigate. Now, some of them did have a reasonably large number of guns on them, but that only really counts if you're taking a more sort of Renaissance era approach where you're also counting all the anti-personnel swivel pieces. If you're looking at actual gun decks with heavy cannon capable of smashing a ship's hull, you're still back to frigate levels. Capitano Lorenzo asks, at Jutland on the first day, as Admiral Hipper and Admiral Beatty tried to find the optimal range for their battlecruisers to initiate firing, the British had terribly overestimated the range to Hipper's ships, thereby squandering their opportunities to engage with their larger guns early without opposition. What was the source of this overestimated range, and how was it possible? Believe it or not, yes, you can also blame this one on Beatty and Seymour. Not that Beatty was telling Seymour what the ranges were to transmit and he was getting them all wrong, but, well, if you look at the immediate run-up to everybody opening fire, Beatty is sending out a series of increasingly complex and fundamentally stupid maneuvering orders. Instead of getting his maneuvers right the first time and getting everybody, including 5th Battle Squadron, into line and heading after the Germans, he makes something along the lines of half a dozen different minor course correction signals, some of which are, wrong, and others he forgets to haul down for several minutes, thoroughly confusing everybody and leaving most of the British units desperately trying to figure out what the heck the flagship is doing and how they should conform to those movements, rather than, pointing their guns and rangefinders at the enemy. Then on top of that, you have the fact that most of the courses that BT actually ends up shaping during this engagement end up with a lot of smoke from his own side. And this is funnel smoke, so before the guns open up, actually interfering with the visibility of the ships following the Lion and Princess Royal and Queen Mary, which are nearer the front, which also doesn't help because, of course, if you've got smoke wafting over you, you're going to find it difficult or possibly impossible to see consistently, so you're going to have to take snatched range readings. And the overall result of that is that despite having the enemy in sight for quite a long time, it seems from the records of the various battle cruisers that survive, they only even start to range on the German battle cruisers a few minutes before they're due to open fire. And of course, your initial range estimates are usually going to be a little bit off with the fire control systems available at the time, and you refine those down through continued observation and then open fire to once you're happy with your first set of estimates, and then check the range. That's what they should have been doing in the 5 minutes running up to the Germans opening fire, but instead they were desperately trying to figure out what Beatty and Seymour were actually trying to get them to do in terms of shaking out into some kind of battle formation. And so with relatively obscure and minimal readings, they were still, left with, a reading that might have been made 2-3 minutes earlier, which necessarily was therefore, because the range was closing by the time they opened fire, somewhat over, and then it took a while for them to figure all this out and correct it. The interesting thing is that Princess Royal, which was second in the line, and apparently was in a position such that lion smoke didn't really interfere with her all that much, actually has some of the most accurate and best readings, because as well as not being interfered with by smoke, she was physically the closest to Lion, so not only most easily able to read the signals that Lion was sending, but also could just conform to Lion's movements, which would give her gunnery crews and the fire control and ranging crews a lot more time to settle in, which explains why she had a vague idea of what was going on compared to the rest of her companions. So yes, believe it or not, you can actually blame Beatty and Seymour for the British battle cruisers not opening fire soon enough, because he was just in the process of confusing them with making them dance a merry jig to his tune. Robert Knapp asks, what is your assessment of the Fairy Barracuda as an aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm, and how was it regarded at the time? I think overall it was definitely a very useful aircraft for the Fleet Air Arm, although perhaps a little bit late, considering when the specification was issued compared to its in-service date. Talk about 6 or 7 years. It would have been a far, far better aircraft if introduced a couple of years earlier, which it theoretically could have been. I mean, obviously the outbreak of war in 1939 would have hindered development, as well as the cancellation of the original engine it was supposed to use. Neither of those helped things. And I think if you compare the Barracuda with the aircraft that were present as torpedo bombers on and around the date it was supposed to enter service, i.e. kind of 41, probably around 41, it actually compares relatively favourably. Plus it has the ability, as you can see from the flaps, to also be a dive bomber. So it's a dual purpose aircraft, which is very useful because it means you only have to have one type of strike aircraft. Because if you want to dive bomb things, the Barracuda can do that. And if you want to torpedo things, the Barracuda can also do this. And it can carry some pretty hefty ordnance as well. I mean, when it went after Tirpitz, Barracudas were carrying 1,600-pound bombs. So it can loft a fair bit of ordnance. It's got a good range. And the top speed's nothing to write home about, but it's not awful. and similarly with the cruise speed. Now, with it being introduced somewhat later down the line in 43, it does suffer a little bit. It has a few strengths and advantages over an Avenger, but broadly speaking, the Avenger has a few more advantages over it. So it's close, but not necessarily quite as good as an Avenger. But of course, it does have that built-in ability to be a dive bomber, which is useful, which is why you see in the latter stages of the war, the British Pacific Fleet has both Avengers and Barracudas in fairly large numbers. And although the Kate is probably slightly outshone by the Barracuda, that shouldn't be too surprising considering the age difference between them. The Kate's successor, the B6N, is broadly speaking a somewhat better aircraft, although again the Barracuda can dive bomb properly and possibly can carry a slightly heavier payload in certain circumstances. But, you know, it's competitive, but it's not a world leader, certainly especially at the time that it's introduced. How was it regarded at the time? Well, up until its introduction, and bearing in mind the Avenger is coming in at around about the same time, the Royal Navy pilots had been told, well, you have Swordfish, you can have an Albacore, but that is your only two options. So being introduced to a monoplane aircraft that's somewhat faster and, well, just all round far superior to the flippin' Albacore, of all things, that would have, you know, that was a big mark in its favour. Plus, of course, as I said, the fact you could alternate between dive bombing and torpedo bombing roles pretty much at will. Some Fleet Air Arm pilots preferred the Barracuda. Most, to be fair, preferred the Avenger, mostly because of its sheer size and heavier machine gun armament gave them something to do, and it was a fraction faster. But there was a good, strong tranche of people who also really liked the Barracuda, and of course, if you were given the option of a Barracuda or an Albacore, anyone who preferred the Albacore would have been deep-sixed very quickly. Lord Nelson asks, during the classic Age of Sail, how were the crews of Royal Navy ships stationed on distant foreign stations like India or China paid? Would the ships carry the cash, or was there another method? It was another method, and that method was simply, you don't get paid. It was broadly held, well, for several reasons. Firstly, it was thought that if you pay people a big chunk of money while they're in some distant and exotic place, that might encourage them to desert the ship, which is not good. Secondly, it would mean the ship would have to carry a fairly large chunk of cash aboard, which would be very, very tempting for everyone from the crew themselves to various raiders to try and steal. You know, if you can capture an enemy ship and it's got a big pay chest on board, well, double win for you. And I suspect you might have seen some kind of sort of Francis Drake style shenanigans where, you know, the enemy ship was captured with £20,000 in cash aboard. Of course, once we transferred the £15,000 to the ship and the £12,000 had been secured on board, and then we docked in the nearest British friendly port, we transferred the £8,000 ashore for examination, and by the time it had gone through the examination and been cleared, the £4,000 were then distributed to the rest of the ship as prize money. Yeah, that almost certainly would have happened, and very much did when rich treasure ships were caught. Now, you might think that sounds horribly unfair, but you've got to remember that, well, if you're on a warship at the time, what do you need the money for? The system of shore leave, the like you would get in the later periods, wasn't really codified. The ship would carry some cash, but that would be for the captain to purchase supplies and things. Your food and your accommodation was all provided by the Navy, so you didn't need money for that. And, you know, what else are you going to spend it on? Navy canteens don't exist on Age of Sail ships of the line. And so when a ship reached the end of its commission and came back to its home port, then you would be paid. So everyone would have the ship's paybooks would be totted up, any deductions for poor behaviour, incarceration, etc. would be made, and then everybody would get paid a large lump sum, including potentially any shares of prize money, although some of that prize money might still be in the process of being adjudicated. So you might end up with that a little bit later down the line, or at least a portion of that. And this is one of the reasons why when a ship came to the end of its commission or the end of its voyage, it was known as paying off. That was literally the case. Everyone was being paid for the services they'd rendered aboard the ship. Starting from the mid-1750s, you could allocate a certain proportion of your pay to be collected back at home by your dependents, because obviously if you go off for a 3 or 4 year voyage and you've got a family at home and they're not receiving any money for that time period, that could be pretty bad. But it was only a portion of the pay unless special circumstances were involved. And of course, when the ship paid off eventually, if the amount that had been paid out was less than you were actually due, then you would be in a bit of a pickle. But that was one of the reasons why only a limited amount was allowed to be paid out. Kyla Stern asks, as far as I understand, one of the big advantages of galleys and galleasses was that you can put rather big cannons right at the front due to them being rather low and in the direction of the ship's spine. How long would that concept be possible to execute? I suspect you couldn't build a super dreadnought with a single gigantic gun along the side of the ship, but at what point would you say this impracticality comes in? In some ways it never went away, because the idea of a directly ahead forward firing massive cannon kind of just stays. There's fewer of them, admittedly, and they do get somewhat lighter than the somewhat absurd 60, 90 or 120 pounder bronze culverins that you can find in some galleys and galleasses. But the concept survives in the form of the bow chaser guns on Age of Sail ships, which remain in early ironclads. And then once you get into turreted and central battery ironclads, the idea of a head fire, usually involving some of, if not the heaviest guns on the ship, still remains. And then, of course, you get turreted ships, and they want to keep their forward arc of fire clear. You get ships like Conqueror or Sansparai or Victoria, where the only major main battery fire is forward, because that's where they only have one turret aiming forward. Obviously, they can aim to either side as well. So you could argue that the concept of big heavy gun mounted relatively low forward and firing dead ahead, pretty much lasts as long as the era of the gun-armed ship does. However, the idea of what you might term a super heavy cannon aimed forward in the way that I said, 90, 120 pounders that you get in some of these ships, the galleys and galleasses, that admittedly does last a little less. Essentially, it lasts about as long as it takes for ships to develop a large broadside that is considerably more powerful than their head firepower. Now, as you can see, the galleass does have broadside firepower as well as a head firepower, but proportionally, it's not massively more than its a head firepower. So, early galleons have heavy guns mounted relatively low, not just as bow chasers, but as a major part of their armament. This is, for example, when Hawkins and Drake break out of San Juan de Ulua. This is why the Jesus of Lubeck, their sort of old galleon that's been loaned to them by the Queen at the time, that it manages to damage or destroy a number of Spanish ships, despite the fact the Spanish ships are broadside onto it, simply because it has these massive great guns mounted in the bow, and while it's kind of, technically it's kedging its way out, or trying to, because it doesn't make it, but, it's kind of crabbing sideways whilst pounding the living daylights out of the Spanish ships with these huge forward guns. And it makes sense for pretty much the same reasons that you would put them on galleys and galleasses. It's in the direction of the ship's keel. The bow is usually fairly heavily built up, and back in those days, the length to breadth ratio of such ships was fairly close. And so, having your bow dipping heavily because of you've got a massive great set of guns there is not so much of a concern. But as ships get longer and longer proportional to beam, so you enter the era of the race-built galleon and so forth, then you have the ability to mount considerably more guns on the side than in the bow, and obviously when your ship is now proportionally longer, any really heavy ordnance you put in the bow or the stern is going to have a much greater effect on the ship's pitching and trim, and so it now becomes a much better option to put the ordnance on the side instead of ahead. Although again, small craft like mortar boats and gunboats and so forth still take this idea because it's the best way of mounting a single large piece of ordnance. Architect096 asks, how big an aircraft carrier do you need to accommodate twin-engine fighters and bombers during the interwar or World War II time period? Would a converted Admiral class be enough, or would it still be too small? To accommodate a twin-engine aircraft, an aircraft carrier doesn't actually have to be all that large. This, for example, is a Potes 56E, an 8-person aircraft, and it is currently, as you can see, in the process of landing on the French aircraft carrier Béarn, which was not exactly a particularly large one as far as fleet carriers went. The larger problem you have to consider is how big is this twin-engine aircraft you want to operate, because not all twin-engine aircraft are created equal when it comes to size. But on top of that, you've also got to factor in how you're going to store them. So, for example, it might surprise you to learn, or not, depending on how much of an aircraft enthusiast you are, that the Grumman Avenger, which is a big but still single-engine strike aircraft, has almost exactly the same wingspan as a de Havilland Mosquito, and actually a 2-foot greater wingspan than a P-38 Lightning, and a slightly less than 1 foot greater wingspan than a BF-110. But the Avenger was a carrier aircraft from the start, and the P-38 and the Messerschmitt never got carrier variants. The de Havilland Mosquito we know did get a Sea Mosquito variant much later on, but despite having in-service dates that are only apart by a couple of months, the Mosquito had to wait till pretty much the end of the war for a carrier variant, whereas the Avenger went straight in as a carrier aircraft. And that comes down principally to one major factor. How do you store them? Now, weirdly enough, in the mid to late 1930s, that would probably be less of an issue, as some aircraft that were used on carriers, even though they were single-engine, also didn't have folding wings. But as time went on and folding wings became more and more common, the biggest issue is if you have something the size of an Avenger, if it is an Avenger, you can fold its wings pretty close to its body, and thus the width that the aircraft is going to take up in floor plan is mostly actually dictated by the width of the tail plane. Unfortunately, if you look at a similar sized twin-engine aircraft, at about the point you'd want to fold the wing, or possibly just outboard of it, depending on the engine layout in question, you have, surprisingly, the engines, which you can't fold. And that means that if you even manage to engineer folding wings on a twin-engine aircraft, the fold is going to be considerably less in terms of reducing width, and that means it's going to take up more space, which is going to be considerably more complicated in terms of, how much of an air group do you actually want. And then you have the issue of weight. Well, 2 engines usually means more weight because it's not only just 2 engines. They may be slightly smaller than something on the size of an Avenger, but there's still everything doubled up, fuel systems, etc. So you've got an aircraft that takes up more space, potentially weighs more. About the only exception in the ones we've discussed so far would be the BF-110, which actually has a slightly smaller overall weight, or lighter overall weight than the Avenger. And with a lot of aircraft carriers, struggling for space already, that pretty much rules out twin-engine aircraft. And then you've got issues of, complexity and maintenance and so on and so forth. And that's before we get into things like landing speeds and takeoff speeds, which, depending on the aircraft, obviously can vary quite a bit. But the flip side is there were smaller twin-engine aircraft which potentially could have been made carrier-capable. Again, without going into the aerodynamics, just looking purely at the size and weight comparisons, I come back to one of my perennial favourites, the Westland Whirlwind, which lengthwise is on a par with the F6F and the F4U, and wing dimensions wise, it's only a couple of feet more, and in fact, it's very similar in overall dimensions, just a fraction shorter wingspan and a fraction longer on the fuselage than a Dauntless. And one of the key reasons to bring up the Dauntless is, of course, the Dauntless didn't have folding wings. So a Westland Whirlwind, in theory, would take up a similar amount of deck space as a Dauntless, and a Dauntless was a perfectly acceptable carrier-borne strike aircraft. And of course, if you then manage to engineer even, the outer half of a Whirlwind's wings being able to fold up, you've now created an aircraft that takes up less space than a Dauntless, which should be a good thing. And obviously then you have a high-performance twin-engine aircraft you can use on a carrier. Again, aerodynamics issues about landing speed and takeoff speed, etc. aside. So I guess the overall answer is that the existing fleet carriers of the interwar period and World War II, and very definitely the large ones, could in theory operate a twin-engine fighter or strike aircraft or combined fighter-strike aircraft if the correct aircraft was present. And for that, ideally, you'd probably want something more along the size of a Whirlwind, i.e. a single-seater, long-range, high-performance twin-engine aircraft that could potentially be both fighter and strike. That would be quite handy, because essentially you've created the self-escorting long-range torpedo bomber, potentially. But of course, you do have the maintenance issues of having twice as many engines, and that even if it does fold up and fit rather neatly, it still can take up a little bit more space than a single-seat fighter with folding wings. We're assuming at this point that both single and twin-engine versions of some aircraft would both have folding wings, because as we discussed, even if they're overall dimensionally the same, the twin-engine aircraft will still take up a bit more space once the wings are folded. And that loops us back round to practicality, at which point, something like Saratoga, Lexington, a Cargi, an Admiral-class aircraft carrier, or an Essex, they would have the hangar space and flight deck space to accommodate fairly large aircraft, relatively speaking. So a small twin-engine aircraft will therefore take up a bit more space than even most of the larger single engines, except for perhaps the Avenger. You could get those on something like an Admiral class because, well, the other option is to carry over 100 aircraft, which is impractically large, as they found out with the Essex class. But it seems that the correct aircraft just didn't show up, at least at the time. Obviously, towards the end of the war, they were thinking about it, F7F, Sea Mosquito, etc., but a little too late for main World War II. And finally, TST1987 asks, this last week of October is Halloween, apparently, when the Patreon Q&A will finally drop. What is your favourite ghostly, spooky or supernatural tale from naval history for the time period the channel covers? Well, I'm not really one for that side of things, generally speaking, but if I was going to pick anything, I would probably go for the good old classic tale of the Flying Dutchman, mostly because it's fascinating in its study. There's, unlike some stories and superstitions that go around in the sea, particularly of this kind of nature, there's not that many origin stories for the Flying Dutchman. Pretty much really only two. But despite the fact that it sort of appears, if you like, way back, in the 1700s, it seems to be oddly persistent. Most stories like this are localized to one very particular location or one very particular ship, and you have to kind of go to that place or that ship to experience it at all, or it might have just been something that happened once and done. Whereas with the Flying Dutchman, something akin to it seems to have been spotted by lots of different people from lots of different ships over an extended period of time, and the sightings are, relatively speaking, coherent with each other and include some very interesting eyewitnesses that you wouldn't normally think of as being the kind of people to make something up out of thin air, including Prince Albert, who would later become King George V. So, yeah, I think that one, because it's a fascinating study into human nature, and, while I wouldn't expect to personally encounter any of these kinds of things wandering around, if I was to see the Flying Dutchman off of the Cape of South Africa, I wouldn't necessarily be entirely shocked. And that wraps us up for this week, and indeed this month, everybody. Thank you very much for listening. There is, of course, a Wednesday video still to come in October, but this is the last Drydock for October, and so we'll start off November next week on November the 3rd with a new Drydock. Well, there's Patreon 5-minute guide before that, but you know what I mean. I'm just starting to ramble a little bit, but hey, we've reached the end of 5.5 hours worth of dry dock. I think I can be forgiven a few seconds for that. And, well, by the time you're listening to this, I will have just completed my presentation aboard USS New Jersey for the Leyte Golf Conference that she's holding, and that, hopefully, will be the last bit of foreign travel I have to do for a good while. So, for those of you who are in foreign climes, i.e. not in the UK, and are hoping to come and say hi or whatever, now you're going to have to wait for 2025. But I do have some interesting travels planned for that year, just not quite as many as 2024. Nonetheless, see you again in another video.